The West Wing's collapse wasn't an accident. It was a message. Dr. Maverick lies broken, whispering one name before he blacks out, Lewis. But as evidence mounts against the brooding outcast, a deeper conspiracy surfaces. In a decaying mansion where mirrors hide truths and trustees trade in betrayal, who turned Lewis into a scapegoat and why?
Chapter 1. The Art of Illusion Begins, a Narrative Expansion. The train sighed to a halt at the sleepy little station of Brackhampton, releasing a plume of steam that momentarily obscured the platform. Miss Jane Marple, neatly attired in her sensible tweed traveling suit and clutching a worn leather handbag, stepped down onto the worn flagstones, her gaze sweeping the scene with the quiet, observant precision of a lifelong student of human nature. The air carried the damp, earthy scent of late autumn, mixed with coal smoke and the faint promise of rain. It was a station that seemed to exist in a gentle state of suspension, untouched by the frantic pace of the world beyond the county boundary. "Miss Marple? Miss Jane Marple?" A voice, surprisingly deep for a woman, cut through the quiet. Standing beside a sturdy, if somewhat battered, Austin Cambridge was a figure of striking contradictions. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with shoulders that suggested a life of physical labor rather than the genteel pursuits expected of a lady's companion. Her face was weathered, framed by untidy gray hair escaping a severe bun, and her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a directness that bordered on challenging. She wore a man's heavy tweed jacket over a thick woolen skirt, and sturdy boots caked with mud. Miss Marple offered a gentle, slightly bemused smile. "Indeed, and you must be—" "Emmeline Carter, Mrs. Van Rydock's— well, I suppose you'd say I run Stonygates, practically anyway." Emmeline's handshake was firm, almost crushing. "Carrie Louise, Mrs. Van Rydock, she's not one for the practicalities. Thinks about souls, not drains. Right then, your bag." Before Miss Marple could protest, Emmeline had efficiently whisked her suitcase into the car's boot. "Hop in, bit of a drive, and the light's fading fast." The journey unfolded through a landscape painted in muted tones of ochre, russet, and deepening green. Rolling fields gave way to dense ancient woodlands where the trees seemed to lean closer, whispering secrets. Emmeline drove with a focused intensity, her knuckles white on the wheel, navigating the narrow, winding lanes with a familiarity bred for necessity. Conversation was sparse, punctuated by the car's wattles and the rhythmic thump of tires on uneven surfaces. "Stonygates," Emmeline announced suddenly as the car crested a low hill, "isn't what you might expect." She gestured with a jerk of her chin towards a break in the trees. "Used to be a proper country pile back in the squire's day. Grand parties, shooting parties, the whole 9 yards. Then it fell on hard times. Now—" she paused, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Resentment? Pride? "Now it's a different kind of establishment." As they drew closer, Miss Marple saw it. Stonygates emerged not as a picture postcard manor house, but as a sprawling, slightly rambling complex of buildings. The core was undoubtedly Victorian, red brick softened by ivy and time, with tall mullioned windows and a central tower that seemed to pierce the gathering twilight. But attached to this core, like barnacles to a ship, were newer, more functional extensions. A long, low building with large, stark windows that hinted at institutional use, and another, smaller structure that might have been a converted stable block. The overall impression was one of uneasy coexistence, faded grandeur jostling with stark utility. "Home to about 30 lads," Emmeline said, her voice flat. "Young offenders, they call them, sent here by the courts or the welfare lot. Carrie Louise's idea, giving them a second chance, fresh air, honest work, guidance." There was a distinct lack of conviction in her tone. "Means the place is always lively, and not always in a good way." They pulled up before the imposing main entrance. A heavy oak door, studded with iron, stood slightly ajar. Before Emmeline could even switch off the engine, the door was pushed fully open by a young man. He couldn't have been more than 18, thin, with a nervous energy that vibrated off him. His eyes darted from Miss Marple to Emmeline and back again. "Miss Carter, sorry, the bell in the east wing's playing up again. Lewis said he'd look at it, but he's been in the potting shed all afternoon." His voice was high, reedy, and he wiped his hands nervously on his trousers. "Right, Tommy. This is Miss Marple, a guest of Mrs. Van Rydoc's. Miss Marple, Tommy, one of our, well, I suppose you'd say our residents." Emmeline's introduction was brisk. "See if you can find Lewis and tell him about the bell. And Tommy, try not to break anything else today." Tommy flushed crimson. "I won't, Miss Carter, honest." He gave Miss Marple a quick, apologetic glance before scurrying away down a dimly lit corridor. Emmeline led Miss Marple inside. The entrance hall was vast, echoing, and surprisingly cold. High ceilings soared above, adorned with elaborate plasterwork that was beginning to crumble in places. A grand staircase swept upwards, its once gleaming banister now dark with age and polish. The air smelled of dust, damp stone, wood smoke, and beneath it all, something faintly antiseptic. It was a place that seemed to exist in a gentle state of suspension, untouched by the frantic pace of the world beyond the county boundary. "Carrie Louise is resting," Emmeline stated, leading the way not towards the grand staircase, but down a less imposing corridor to the left. "She tires easily. She's expecting you in the blue drawing room in about a half an hour. I'll show you to your room first." She pushed open a door. "This is you, the rose room, one of the quieter ones, overlooking the back gardens, or what's left of them." A rose-patterned wallpaper, heavy dark furniture, a large canopied bed. A fire had been laid in the small grate but not lit. A single window looked out not onto manicured lawns, but on a tangled wilderness of overgrown shrubs and a neglected fountain choked with weeds. Beyond that, Miss Marple could see the stark, functional lines of the building Emmeline had pointed out earlier. A light burned in one of its windows, casting a harsh yellow rectangle on into the dusk. A figure moved past the window, silhouetted briefly. A young man, perhaps, shoulders hunched. "Settle in," Emmeline said, already turning toward the door. "Dinner's at 7. Don't be late. The lads eat earlier, but the staff and any guests dine with Carrie Louise. It can be unpredictable." She paused at the threshold. "One thing, Miss Marple. Carrie Louise sees the best in everyone. Sometimes she sees things that aren't there, or chooses not to see things that are. Keep that in mind." With that enigmatic warning, she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Left alone, Miss Marple unpacked her few belongings with methodical care. She placed her knitting bag on a chair, her small Bible on the bedside table, and hung up her traveling clothes. As she worked, her sharp eyes took in every detail of the room: the slight scuff mark near the door, the faint water stain on the ceiling shaped like a distorted map of England, the way the heavy curtains didn't quite meet in the middle, leaving a sliver of the darkening garden visible. Nothing escaped her notice.
A sudden, sharp sound shattered the quiet. A crash,
followed by a muffled curse and the frantic scrabbling of something being dragged. It came from somewhere below, perhaps the floor beneath. Miss Marple moved silently to the door and opened it a crack. The corridor was empty, dimly lit by a single bulb at the far end. The sounds had ceased. Silence descended once more, thick and expectant. It was the silence of a place holding its breath. Half an hour later, guided by a hastily sketched map Emmeline had left, Miss Marple found her way to the blue drawing-room. The name was optimistic. The walls were indeed covered in faded blue silk, but the color was melancholy in the gloom, like a bruise. The furniture was heavy, overstuffed, and arranged with a formality that felt stiff and unwelcoming. A large fire roared in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows that made the room feel alive, almost watchful. Seated in a high-backed wing chair near the fire was a woman who seemed to embody the faded elegance of Stonygates itself. Carrie Louise Van Rydock was small, bird-like, with fine white hair arranged in soft waves around a face that was still remarkably beautiful, though etched with the lines of age and perhaps chronic anxiety. Her eyes, a pale, watery blue, were wide and surprisingly intense as they fixed on Miss Marple. "Jane, my dear Jane, how wonderful to see you!" Her voice was soft, musical, but carried an undercurrent of fragility. She held out a thin, ringless hand. "Emmeline said you'd arrived safely. Such a comfort to have you here, such a comfort indeed." She gestured to a nearby chair. "Do sit down. Would you like some tea? Ruth will bring it shortly. Ruth tries." As Miss Marple settled into the chair, which sighed under her weight, she took in the room's other occupants. Standing rather stiffly near the window was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a severe gray suit that seemed at odds with the room's faded charm. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her expression was one of perpetual disapproval. This must be Ruth, Miss Marple deduced. Prowling restlessly near the bookshelves was a man in his late 30s, dressed in tweeds that saw better days. He was tall, dark-haired, with a restless energy that seemed to fill the space around him. He picked up a book, flipped through it, without reading, and slammed it shut again. His movements were sharp, almost aggressive. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, turning towards her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Edgar Lawson. I run the educational side of things here, try to instill a little culture, a little discipline." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "An uphill battle, as you can imagine. Mostly uphill." "Edgar is invaluable," Carrie Louise murmured, her gaze drifting toward him with a look that was part affection, part apprehension. "He has such passion." "Passion is one word for it," Ruth muttered, just loud enough to be heard. She moved towards a small table where a tea service was laid out. "Tea, Mrs. Rydock? Miss Marple?" As Ruth poured, her movements precise and economical, Carrie Louise leaned forward conspiratorially. "It's so good to have a friendly face, Jane, someone from the outside world who understands. Sometimes I feel quite overwhelmed here, so many conflicting energies, so much potential for misunderstanding." She sighed, a delicate fluttering sound. "The boys, they have such difficult backgrounds, so much anger, but they need guidance, love. They need to see that goodness exists." "Goodness exists where you choose to see it, Carrie Louise," Edgar interjected, his voice suddenly sharp. He stopped his pacing and stared into the fire. "Sometimes choosing not to see the bad is dangerous. It allows it to fester." "Nonsense, Edgar," Carrie Louise said, though her voice lacked conviction. "There is always hope, always a chance for redemption. That's what Stonygates is for.
"Redemption," Ruth snorted softly, placing a cup of tea in Miss Marple's hands. "Some of them are beyond redemption, madam. They're here because the courts don't know what else to do with them. They're manipulative, violent." "That's enough, Ruth." Carrie Louise's voice, though still soft, held a surprising firmness. "We do not judge, we guide. We offer a different path." She turned back to Miss Marple, her expression pleading. "You understand, don't you, Jane? You've seen so much of life. You know how appearances can deceive. How someone who seems rough might have a heart of gold, and someone who seems charming." She trailed off, her gaze drifting towards the door. Miss Marple followed her look. Standing in the doorway, observing the scene with an unnerving stillness, was a young man. He was perhaps 20, with lank fair hair that fell over his forehead and eyes that were a pale, unsettling gray. He was dressed in plain, dark trousers and a shirt that was slightly too big for him. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply watched, his expression blank, unreadable. "Ah, Louis," Carrie Louise said, her voice brightening slightly. "Come in, dear. Louis is one of our success stories, Jane. He's been with us almost 2 years now. Very quiet, very dedicated. Helps Emmeline with the grounds. Does repairs. Very skilled with his hands." She beamed at the young man. "Louis, this is my dear friend Miss Marple." Louis took a single step into the room. His eyes flickered towards Miss Marple, a brief assessing glance, before settling back on Carrie Louise. He gave a minimal nod, the only acknowledgement he offered. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and was gone, vanishing back into the dim corridor without a sound. "It's a bit shy," Carrie Louise explained, though she noted the slight tremor in her hand as she picked up her teacup. "But he has a good heart, a very good heart. He wouldn't hurt a fly." "He wouldn't hurt a fly," Edgar Lawson snorted again, a harsh, ugly sound. "He wouldn't hurt a fly? Carrie Louise, you see what you want to see. That boy is like a coiled spring. There's darkness in him. I've seen it. The way he watches, the way he moves, like a predator stalking prey." "That's ridiculous, Edgar," Carrie Louise said, angrily, her voice rising, becoming shrill. "Louis is gentle. He's devoted to me. He saved my favorite vase when Tommy knocked it off the table last week. He caught it perfectly." "Did he now?" Edgar's tone was laden with skepticism. "Or did he position himself perfectly to ensure it fell in the first place, to play the hero?" "These boys are manipulative, Carrie Louise. They learn the scripts we want to hear. They become the characters we need them to be. It's all performance." "It is not performance," Carrie Louise insisted, her knuckles white on her teacup. "There is genuine goodness here. I feel it. I see it." The tension in the room crackled, thick enough to feel. Ruth stood rigidly by the tea table, her face a mask of disapproval. Edgar glared at Carrie Louise, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple sat quietly, sipping her tea, her gaze moving from one face to another, absorbing the dynamics, the unspoken currents of fear, resentment, and desperate belief. Suddenly, the large mirror above the fireplace caught Miss Marple's attention. It was an ornate builded thing, slightly tarnished, reflecting the entire room. In its distorted surface, she saw Carrie Louise's anxious face, Edgar's clenched fist, Ruth's rigid posture. But she also saw something else, something just beyond the edge of the mirror's frame, a flicker of movement in the deep shadows of the corridor outside the half-open door, a pale face, quickly withdrawn. Louis, or someone else. The mirror showed only fragments, reflections of reflections. "It's getting late," Ruth announced abruptly, her voice cutting through the charged silence. "Dinner will be served shortly, Mrs. Rydock. Miss Marple, your room is prepared if you wish to freshen up."
Carrie Louise seemed to deflate, the brief flare of anger extinguished. Yes, of course. Forgive me, Jane. We get passionate here. About the work. About the boys. She managed a weak smile. We'll talk more later. Properly. It will be lovely to catch up properly. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Edgar Lawson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur, meant only for her. Miss Marple, you seem observant. Be careful what you believe here, what you see, especially what Carrie Louise sees. This place, it's built on illusions. Good intentions, perhaps, but illusions nonetheless. And mirrors, he added, his gaze flicking towards the gilded glass above the fireplace, can be very deceiving. They reflect only what's placed before them, and sometimes what's placed before them is a carefully constructed lie. He gave her a curt nod, then turned away, resuming his restless pacing by the bookshelves, his back stiff with unresolved tension. Miss Marple followed Ruth from the blue drawing-room, the echo of Edgar's words lingering in the air. The corridor outside was dimmer, colder. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. As she walked towards the rose room, she passed a closed door. Behind it, she heard the low murmur of voices, angry and urgent, then the sharp sound of something being slammed against a wall, a muffled cry, then silence. She paused for a moment, her hand hovering near the door handle. The sounds had ceased. The corridor was empty, bathed in the weak glow of the distant wall light. She continued to her room, the image of the gilded mirror replaying in her mind, reflecting the room's occupants, the flickering fire, the tension, and that fleeting glimpse of movement in the corridor beyond. A reflection of something real, or just another trick of the light, another layer in the unfolding illusion. Inside the rose room, Miss Marple closed the door firmly behind her. The neglected garden outside was now completely swallowed by darkness. The only light came from the single bulb on the bedside table. She sat down in the armchair, picked up her knitting, but her needles lay idle in her lap. Her mind was not on the stitches. It was on Stonygates, on the fragile hope in Carrie Louise's eyes, the simmering anger in Edgar's voice, the blank watchfulness of Lewis, the disapproval etched on Ruth's face, on the crash below, the muffled voices behind the closed door, on the unsettling stillness of the young man who had appeared and vanished like a ghost. Emmeline's warning echoed. Carrie Louise sees the best in everyone. Sometimes she sees things that aren't there, or chooses not to see things that are. And Edgar's parting shot, this place, it's built on illusions, and mirrors can be very deceiving. Miss Marple looked towards the window, but saw only her own faint reflection in the dark glass, a small, white-haired woman, seemingly insignificant, yet her mind was already piecing together fragments, sensing the fault lines beneath the surface. The art of illusion had begun its subtle, insidious work at Stonygates, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet, unassuming presence, had just become its newest and perhaps most perceptive audience. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the first faint whispers of deception were already curling through the corridors like smoke. The real performance, she suspected, was only just beginning. She picked up her knitting needles, the click-clack a soft, steady counterpoint to the unsettling silence of the house,
a small anchor of normalcy in a place already brimming with hidden currents and carefully constructed falsehoods. The master class had commenced.
Chapter 2. Stonygates, a stage built for deception. The morning light at Stonygates was a pale, reluctant thing, filtering weakly through the grime-caked windows of the vast breakfast room. It did little to dispel the atmosphere of weary grandeur that clung to the place like cobwebs. Miss Marple, seated at a long mahogany table polished to a dull sheen by generations of indifferent housemaids, observed the scene with her customary quiet intensity. The room spoke of faded glory, heavy velvet curtains threadbare at the hems, a massive sideboard bearing chipped porcelain, portraits of severe, long-dead Van Rydocks gazing down with disapproval. Carrie Louise presided at one end, a fragile queen in her dilapidated court. She picked listlessly at a piece of toast, her pale eyes fixed on the doorway, as if expecting salvation or doom. To her right, Ruth Van Rydock, Carrie Louise's sister by marriage, sat rigidly upright, dissecting a grapefruit with surgical precision. Her gray suit was immaculate, a stark contrast to the room's shabbiness, her expression one of perpetual, disapproving vigilance. Opposite Miss Marple, Edgar Lawson pushed congealed eggs around his plate, his dark eyes shadowed and restless. Emmeline Carter, already bustling despite the early hour, poured coffee with a clatter, her practical tweed jacket seeming to absorb the room's gloom. "Sleep well, Miss Marple?" Emmeline asked, her voice brisk but lacking warmth. "The Rose Room can be a bit drafty. Old houses." "Perfectly adequately, thank you, Miss Carter. One becomes accustomed to the character of old houses." "Character?" Ruth snorted, not looking up. "I'd call it neglect. This place is a money pit, Carrie Louise. A noble experiment, perhaps, but financially ruinous. The roof leaks in the west wing, the boiler groans like a dying man, and don't get me started on the state of the electrical wiring. It's a wonder it hasn't burned to the ground." Carrie Louise flinched slightly. "The boys need stability, Ruth, a sense of permanence. Constant upheaval? It wouldn't be good for them." "Stability?" Edgar's voice was sharp, cutting through the domestic hum. He finally abandoned his eggs, leaning forward with an intensity that made Ruth glance up, startled. "Is that what you call it? This place is a powder keg, Carrie Louise. You have 30 young men here, most with histories of violence, theft, or worse. You house them in a crumbling maze where half the doors don't lock properly, where corridors lead to dead ends or forgotten storage rooms, where anyone could be anywhere at any time. It's not stability, it's negligence." "Nonsense, Edgar." Carrie Louise's voice, though frail, held a note of steel. "They are supervised. They have structure, work, therapy, education." "Therapy?" Edgar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Maverick's experiments? Pumping them full of God knows what while he scribbles notes? That's not therapy, Carrie Louise. That's a human laboratory. And structure? When Lewis can vanish for hours at a time, reappearing with some flimsy excuse about checking the fences? When Tommy was found in the East Wing attics yesterday, trying to pry open an old trunk? It's chaos disguised as order." Miss Marple noted the way Ruth's knuckles whitened on her fork at the mention of Lewis. Emmeline's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Carrie Louise simply looked tired, her brief defiance evaporating. "Boys will be boys, Edgar," she murmured. "They need room to breathe, to explore." "To explore?" Edgar slammed his hand flat on the table, making the cutlery jump. "They need boundaries, clear, unbreakable boundaries. This place, its very layout encourages deception. Hiding places everywhere, vantage points to watch without being seen. It's designed for secrets, Carrie Louise, built for it." His words hung in the air, charged with an unexpected fervor. Miss Marple found herself recalling the gilded mirror in the blue drawing room, the glimpse of movement in the corridor. Built for secrets. The phrase resonated uncomfortably. Before anyone could respond, the heavy oak door swung open. A young woman stood framed in the doorway, a stark contrast to the room's muted tones. She was perhaps 25, dressed in impeccably tailored emerald green wool that hugged her figure,
her dark hair cut in a fashionable, severe bob. Her face was striking, with high cheekbones and large, dark eyes that swept the room with an assessing gaze that held no warmth. She carried an expensive-looking leather briefcase. "Carrie Louise," she said, her voice cool, cultured, and utterly devoid of affection. "I trust I'm not interrupting anything vital." "Gina," Carrie Louise's face lit up with a genuine, if weary, smile. "My dear stepdaughter, how wonderful to see you. Do come in, join us. This is Miss Marple, an old friend of mine. Gina Van Rydock, Miss Marple." Gina offered Miss Marple a brief, perfunctory nod, her eyes already scanning the room, lingering for a fraction too long on Edgar, then Ruth. "A pleasure," she murmured, the words sounding anything but. She moved toward the table with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in the shabby room. "I won't be staying, just delivering the quarterly reports." She placed the briefcase on the table with a decisive click. "The financial situation remains precarious." Ruth seized on this like a lifeline. "Precarious? Gina, it's catastrophic. The trustees are breathing down my neck. The maintenance costs alone are unsustainable. Carrie Louise's little social experiment is bleeding us dry." Gina opened the briefcase, extracting a slim folder. "The figures speak for themselves, Aunt Ruth. Income from the trust is dwindling. Donations are down. The cost of specialized staff, security upgrades, Dr. Maverick's research budget." She slid the folder toward Ruth. "Something has to give. We cannot continue like this." Carrie Louise's face crumpled. "But the boys, the work we do." "The work," she interrupted smoothly, her voice like chilled steel, "is becoming an unaffordable luxury. The trustees have suggested alternatives." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "More cost-effective facilities, perhaps focusing on younger offenders, with shorter-term programs, less intensive care." "Less care? You mean less expense?" Edgar snapped, his eyes flashing. "You'd throw them out, send them back to the streets or to some brutal institution for the sake of balancing a ledger?" "Reality, Edgar, is a harsh taskmaster. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills or fix the roof." She turned back to Carrie Louise, her expression softening by a microscopic degree. "We need to discuss this, privately, soon." Carrie Louise looked suddenly old, her shoulders slumping. "Of course, Gina. Later, after breakfast."
Gina gave a curt nod. "Don't leave it too long." She snapped her briefcase shut. "I have another appointment. Good morning." With that, she turned and swept out of the room as abruptly as she had entered, leaving a wake of tension thicker than the porridge. The silence that followed was profound. Ruth stared grimly at the financial report. Edgar scowled into his cold coffee. Emmeline began clearing plates with unnecessary clatter. Carrie Louise simply stared at the door Gina had exited, her expression one of bewildered hurt. Miss Marple finished her toast, her mind whirring. Gina's arrival had been like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of anxiety and resentment through the already troubled waters of Stonygates. The financial pressure was a new, potent element in the volatile mix. Desperation, she knew from long experience, was a powerful motivator for deception. Later that morning, seeking a moment of quiet reflection away from the oppressive atmosphere of the main house, Miss Marple decided to explore the grounds. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out through a side door she'd noted earlier led towards the neglected gardens. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The garden Carrie Louise had mentioned was indeed a wilderness. Tangled rose bushes, choked flower beds, the broken fountain now slick with green algae. Beyond it, the stark, functional lines of the rehabilitation wing loomed, a brutal counterpoint to the Victorian Gothic of the main house. As she walked, Miss Marple became aware of a low, rhythmic thudding sound. It came from the direction of the rehabilitation wing. Curious, she followed the sound,
her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path that led towards the newer building. The path ended abruptly at a heavy, unadorned metal door. The thudding was louder here, punctuated by muffled shouts and the clang of metal on metal. This was clearly the domain of the young offenders. Hesitantly, Miss Marple pushed open the door. Inside was a large, high-ceilinged workshop. The air smelled of sawdust, oil, and sweat. Several young men in rough work clothes were engaged in various tasks, sawing wood, hammering metal, shaping clay on a potter's wheel. The noise was considerable, a chaotic symphony of industry. Supervising them was a powerfully built man in his 50s, with a bald head, a thick beard, and arms like tree trunks. He barked an order, his voice easily cutting through the din, and a lanky teenager stopped kicking a piece of sheet metal and sullenly returned to his workbench. This Miss Marple realized must be Jos Walters, the man Emmeline had mentioned briefly as the workshop foreman. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in a frown. "Lost, are you, miss?" he called out, his voice a deep rumble. "This ain't the visitor center." "Mr. Walters," Miss Marple approached, keeping her voice calm. "Miss Jane Marple, a guest of Mrs. Van Rydock's. I was just exploring the grounds. The sound led me here." Jos wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze assessing. "Aye, the lads make a racket. Good for 'em. Burns off the energy." He gestured around the workshop. "Keeps 'em busy. Teaches 'em a trade. Or tries to. Some take to it. Tommy over there," he nodded towards the nervous youth Miss Marple had met yesterday, who was now painstakingly sanding a wooden box. "He's got a real eye for detail. Lewis—" Jos paused, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. "Lewis is good with his hands, fixes things. Quiet, though. Too quiet sometimes." Miss Marple scanned the workshop. It was surprisingly well equipped, but the atmosphere was tense. The boys worked with a kind of sullen intensity, avoiding eye contact, their movements quick and guarded. I noticed something else, the layout. The workbenches were arranged in a way that created narrow aisles and blind corners. Large pieces of machinery and stacks of materials created partial walls, breaking up the space. It would be easy, she thought, to disappear into this maze, to watch without being seen, to move unseen from one point to another. Like the main house, the workshop was a landscape designed for concealment. "Structured activity is vital for rehabilitation," Miss Marple remarked conversationally. Jos grunted. "Aye, the doc has his theories. Spends more time writing notes than watching the lads work, if you ask me. Comes in, observes, scribbles in his little book, then disappears back to his rooms. Prefers his test tubes and his charts to the sawdust and the noise." He spat the words out with clear disdain. "Give me a lad who can swing a hammer or turn a lathe over one who can talk about his feelings any day. Actions speak louder than words, miss. Always have." I nodded thoughtfully. "And does Lewis speak with his actions, Mr. Walters?" Jos looked at her sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Lewis does what is told, mostly. Keeps himself to himself. Like I said, good with his hands, handy to have around." He turned away abruptly, raising his voice. "Right, you lot! Break time's over. Back to it. And Billy, stop trying to carve your initials into that bench with a chisel. Use the sandpaper like I showed you." The noise level rose again as the boys reluctantly resumed work. Miss Marple took the dismissal for what it was. She had learned little concrete about Lewis, but Jos's reaction, the hardening of his expression, the abrupt change of subject, spoke volumes. There was fear there, or perhaps suspicion. Lewis inspired strong, conflicting feelings. He was useful, but unsettling. A valuable tool, but potentially dangerous.
As she turned to leave, Miss Marple noticed a door set into the far wall of the workshop, partially obscured by a stack of wooden crates. It was a plain, unmarked door, unlike the others which led to storage cupboards or the outside. It seemed out of place. Where did it lead? Before she could investigate further, Joss's voice boomed out again. "Need a hand finding your way back, miss? It's easy to get turned around in here." "Thank you, Mr. Walters," Miss Marple replied smoothly, "but I believe I can manage." She gave him a polite smile and walked back towards the main entrance, her mind fixed on that unmarked door. Another secret passage? Another layer to Stonygates' deceptive architecture? Instead of returning directly to the main house, Miss Marple found herself drawn towards the rehabilitation wing itself. It was a long, low building, constructed of functional red brick with rows of identical barred windows. It looked less like a home and more like an institution. A separate, smaller door stood open near the main entrance. Peering inside, she saw a stark linoleum-floored corridor. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant. A sign on the wall read, "Administration and Therapy Suites. Staff only." Driven by a curiosity that bordered on the uncharacteristic, Miss Marple stepped inside. The corridor was deserted, illuminated by harsh fluorescent strip lights that hummed overhead. Doors lined the walls, most closed. One stood slightly ajar. From within came the low murmur of voices. One voice, calm, measured, authoritative, unmistakably Dr. Maverick. The other was higher, strained, pleading. Miss Marple moved silently closer, positioning herself just outside the doorframe, hidden by the angle. "But it's not working, Dr. Maverick. The injections, they make me feel strange, jittery, like my skin doesn't fit, and the dreams." The voice belonged to a young man, thick with distress. "Regression is a natural part of the process, Stephen. The medication is designed to unlock repressed pathways, to bring underlying conflicts to the surface where they can be addressed. The dreams are significant. They represent your subconscious grappling with past trauma. We must work through them." "But I don't want to dream about that night. I told you, I don't want to remember." The voice broke.
Suppressing it only gives it power, Stephen. You know that. The injections are a key, a necessary key. The side effects are temporary, the potential for breakthrough permanent. There was a pause. "Now, I have your consent to continue the treatment, as outlined in the agreement you signed?" A long silence, then a choked, defeated whisper. "Yes, yes, all right." "Good. Excellent. Report to Nurse Jennings for your dose at 3, and remember to document your dreams in the journal I provided. Every detail is crucial." Miss Marple heard the rustle of papers, then footsteps approaching the door. She quickly retreated down the corridor, turning a corner just as the young man, Stephen presumably, emerged from the office. He was thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He walked hunched over, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, radiating misery and fear. He didn't notice Miss Marple. Dr. Maverick appeared in the doorway a moment later. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a slightly rumpled tweed jacket, his hair thinning, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He carried a clipboard. He watched Stephen disappear down the corridor with a clinical, almost predatory interest, then turned back into his office, closing the door firmly. Miss Marple leaned against the cool wall, her heart beating a little faster. The conversation she'd overheard was deeply unsettling. Dr. Maverick's treatment sounded less like therapy and more like coercion, using powerful drugs to force vulnerable young men to relive traumatic experiences against their will. And he had their consent? Obtained under duress by the sound of it. It was a different kind of deception, not hiding the truth, but twisting it, manipulating it under the guise of medical authority. It was exploitation disguised as care. Shaken, Miss Marple decided she had seen enough for one morning. She needed the quiet sanctuary of the Rose Room. She retraced her steps, intending to head back towards the main house. As she passed the workshop again, she noticed the unmarked door was now slightly ajar. Joss was nowhere in sight. The boys were still absorbed in their noisy tasks. Impulsively, Miss Marple slipped through the door. It led not into another room, but into a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air was stale, smelling of dust and damp stone. Rough brick walls lined either side. This wasn't part of the modern rehabilitation wing. This felt old, part of the original Stonygates foundations. It was a hidden passage, just as she had suspected. It sloped downwards, curving slightly into darkness. Where did it lead? To the cellars? To forgotten rooms? Or, perhaps, to other parts of the house, unseen? Driven by a sense of profound unease and a detective's instinct to uncover the hidden architecture of deception, Miss Marple began to walk cautiously down the passage. The only light came from a bare bulb hanging far ahead, casting long, dancing shadows. Her footsteps echoed softly on the uneven flagstones. The passage branched once, then again. It was a genuine labyrinth beneath the already confusing house. She rounded a final corner and stopped. The passage ended abruptly at a heavy wooden door, banded with iron. It looked ancient, sturdy. It was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Hesitantly, Miss Marple pushed it open. She found herself in a large, vaulted cellar. It was clearly unused, filled with cobweb-shrouded furniture, broken crates, and the accumulated detritus of decades. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a small, grimy window set high in the wall. But it wasn't the clutter that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the far corner. There, half hidden beneath a tarpaulin, was a large, ornate object. It looked like a wardrobe, or perhaps an old-fashioned screen. Curiosity overcoming caution, Miss Marple approached and pulled back the heavy canvas. It wasn't a wardrobe. It was a mirror. A huge, magnificent floor-to-ceiling mirror framed in intricately carved dark wood that was now blackened with age and grime. The glass itself was obscured by layers of dirt and dust, but even so, it seemed to possess a strange, unsettling presence. It was far too large and grand for a forgotten cellar. Why was it here, hidden away? As Miss Marple stared at it, trying to discern her own reflection in the murky glass, something else caught her eye. Lying on the floor beside the mirror's base, almost swallowed by the dust, was a small leather-bound book. It looked old, well used. She picked it up. It was a ledger. Opening it carefully, she saw pages filled with neat, precise handwriting, dates, times, names, Lewis, Tommy, Stephen, Edgar Lawson, Dr. Maverick, and beside them, notations that looked like codes or abbreviations. Payments? Observations? Something else entirely? She couldn't decipher it quickly, but the sheer presence of a hidden ledger next to a hidden mirror in a hidden cellar screamed of secrets meticulously kept. She closed the ledger, her mind racing. This was a nexus of deception. The hidden passage, the concealed mirror, the cryptic ledger, they were physical manifestations of the lies and manipulations swirling through Stonygates. This was where the illusions were crafted, where the reflections were controlled. As she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something else half buried in the dust, near the ledger. It was a small, crumpled piece of cloth. She picked it up. It was fine linen, white, or had been. Now it was stained with a dark, rusty brown patch that was unmistakably dried blood. Miss Marple held the stained cloth in her gloved hand, the chill of the cellar seeping into her bones. The mirror loomed beside her, its murky surface reflecting only distorted shadows. The ledger felt heavy with untold secrets. The bloodstain was a visceral, shocking punctuation mark. Stonygates wasn't just a stage built for deception. It was a labyrinth designed to conceal the truth,
a hall of mirrors where reality was fractured and manipulated. And somewhere, in its twisting corridors, hidden rooms, and beneath the weight of its secrets, violence had already been done. The art of illusion had taken a darker, more dangerous turn. Miss Marple carefully folded the stained cloth, tucked the ledger under her arm, and stepped back into the hidden passage, the weight of discovery settling upon her. The performance had escalated beyond mere disdirection. The stage was now set for tragedy.
Chapter 3. The Web of Relationships. Deception through Character. The blood-stained cloth lay like a dark secret on Miss Marple's bedside table, its presence a silent accusation against the faded elegance of the rose room. Outside, the weak autumn sun struggled to pierce the persistent gloom, casting long, distorted shadows across the neglected garden. Inside, Miss Marple sat bolt upright in the armchair, the heavy ledger open on her lap, her knitting needles forgotten. The neat, precise handwriting within its pages formed a cryptic tapestry of Stonygates' hidden life. October 12th, LL, OBS, E-Law, agitation. Note, proximity to CL, volatile. October 14th, TB, session MAV, resistance, increased dosage. October 17th, SC, night terrors severe. Joss reports workshop incident concealed. October 19th, EL, confrontation LL, threats witnessed. October 22nd, payment recede. Source, GVR. The entries were fragments, whispers of conflict and observation. LL was clearly Lewis. EL, Edgar Lawson. TB, likely Tommy Bell, the nervous youth. SC, Stephen, the distressed boy from Maverick's office. CL, Carrie Louise. GVR, Gina Van Rydock. Payments. For what? Silence? Services. The ledger was a map of alliances, fears, and transactions, written in a code only its author understood. Miss Marple's finger traced the entry about Edgar's confrontation with Lewis. Threats. Witnessed. Who witnessed? And what was the nature of the threat? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Ruth Van Rydock entered without waiting for a response, carrying a small vase of chrysanthemums that looked slightly worse for wear. She placed it on the dresser with a thud. "Thought these might brighten the place up," she said, her voice tight. "The gardeners, well, they try." Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a fraction too long on the ledger lying open on Miss Marple's lap. Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Found some light reading, I see." Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, placing it beside the blood-stained cloth. "One does one's best to understand one's surroundings, Mrs. Van Rydock. This house, it has many layers." Ruth's lips thinned, layers of dust and decay more like, and secrets, always secrets. She gestured vaguely towards the window. "Carrie Louise thrives on them, thinks it adds mystique. It adds danger, if you ask me." Her eyes flickered towards the blood-stained cloth. Her breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. She took a step closer, peering at it. "What on earth?" "It appears to be a piece of linen," Miss Marple said calmly, though her senses were alert to Ruth's reaction. "Found in a rather neglected part of the house. One wonders about its provenance." Ruth paled slightly. She reached out a trembling hand, then snatched it back. "Neglected? Where? Not the cellars. Those dreadful places are full of junk, broken things, sharp things." Her voice had risen slightly, becoming shrill. "It's probably nothing, an old rag.
One of the boys likely cut themselves. They're always getting into scrapes." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, watching Ruth's face intently. The woman's fear was palpable, but was it fear of discovery or fear for someone? "It does look quite old. The stain, dried blood, I believe." Ruth flinched as if struck. "Blood? Don't be ridiculous. It's rust. Or paint. Yes, paint. Lewis was supposed to be painting the railings last week. Probably got it on his rag." She turned away abruptly, fussing with the chrysanthemums, her movements jerky. "Honestly, Miss Marple, jumping to conclusions. It's unbecoming and unhelpful. Carrie Louise doesn't need unpleasantness." "Unpleasantness has a way of making itself known, regardless of our wishes, Mrs. Van Rydock," Miss Marple said softly, "particularly in a place as complex as Stonygates." "Complex? Is that what you call it?" "I call it a powder keg. Edgar prowling like a caged animal, Lewis skulking in the shadows, Gina breathing down our necks about money, and Maverick playing God with those boys' minds." She broke off, pressing her hand to her temple. "And Carrie Louise, blind, utterly blind to the dangers right under her nose. She sees only the good she wants to see. It's madness." "Madness?" Miss Marple echoed. "Or misplaced faith." "Faith!" Ruth gave a harsh, humorless laugh. "It's willful ignorance. And it's going to get someone hurt, or worse." Her eyes darted back to the blood-stained cloth, then away. "I should go. Carrie Louise will be wondering where I am." She moved towards the door, then paused, her hand on the knob. "Miss Marple, be careful what you dig up here. Some things, some secrets, are buried for a reason. Disturbing them serves no one." With that ominous warning, she left, closing the door firmly behind her. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment. Ruth's reaction was far more telling than the cloth itself. Fear, yes, but layered with defensiveness and a desperate desire to protect Carrie Louise from what? The truth about Lewis? About Edgar? About the blood itself? And her mention of Lewis painting railings, was that an alibi or a misdirection? The image of the ledger entry, October 19th, EL, confrontation LL, threats witnessed, flashed in her mind. Edgar and Lewis, confrontation, threats. And now Ruth's fear. The web was tightening, its strands entangling Edgar, Lewis, Ruth, and by extension, Carrie Louise. Later that afternoon, seeking a different perspective, Miss Marple found herself in the large, chilly conservatory that adjoined the main house. It was a relic of Stonygates' grander days, its glass panes grimy, many cracked or patched. Exotic plants, long neglected, grew in a tangled, unruly jungle, their leaves thick with dust. Sunlight struggled through the dirty glass, creating dappled, shifting patterns on the flagstone floor. Carrie Louise was there, seated on a wicker bench, attempting to prune a leggy bougainvillea with a pair of blunt shears. Gina Van Rydock stood nearby, immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, checking her watch with impatience. "Mother, this is pointless," Gina said crisply. "This conservatory is an eyesore. It should be torn down, or at the very least cleared out. It's a waste of space and heating."
Gina raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Lewis, the resident ghost? I doubt his gentle touch extends much beyond whatever he's instructed to do. And Stephen's drawings, are they part of Dr. Maverick's breakthrough therapy, or just another expensive hobby the trust is funding? She sighed, a sound of profound exasperation. "We need to face reality, Mother. The trust is nearly insolvent. The board is demanding action. We either downsize drastically, close this wing, reduce the program, focus on shorter-term, less intensive care, or we find significant new funding, fast. Carrie Louise's hands stilled. She looked down at the shears, her shoulders slumping. Downsize? Send the boys away? Where would they go, Gina? Back to that? After all I've promised them? Promises based on fantasy, Mother, Gina said, her tone softening slightly, but losing none of its edge. You promise them salvation you can't deliver. It's cruel, to them and to yourself, and to Ruth and me, left to pick up the pieces. She gestured around the decaying conservatory. This place, it's a monument to your good intentions, but it's collapsing under the weight of its own impracticality. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. Miss Van Rydock, might I ask, are there no other options? Benefactors? Perhaps leveraging the historical value of Stonygates itself? Gina turned her cool gaze on Miss Marple. Historical value. It's a crumbling pile, Miss Marple. The cost of restoration would dwarf the entire annual budget of the trust. As for benefactors, they want results, success stories, not vague promises of redemption. They want statistics, low recidivism rates, positive outcomes. Dr. Maverick's work, she paused, a flicker of something, distaste, skepticism crossing her face. His methods are unorthodox, difficult to quantify, difficult to sell to a board concerned with liability and public image. Dr. Maverick is brilliant, Carrie Louise insisted, a spark of her old conviction returning. He understands the boys' minds. He's reaching parts no one else can. Stephen, he was so withdrawn, so full of rage. Now he's beginning to talk, to express. At what cost, Mother? Gina countered sharply. Have you seen Stephen lately? He looks like a ghost, pale, trembling, jumping at shadows. Is that progress? Or is Maverick just breaking him down to build him back up into whatever he wants? And who's paying for these breakthrough therapies? The ledger entries I've seen, significant sums allocated to specialized therapeutic resources, unaccounted for. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Ledger entries. Gina had seen them, or similar ones. The payments noted in the hidden ledger, payment received, source G.V. Was Gina the source, or was she merely aware of them? Dr. Maverick knows what he's doing, Carrie Louise insisted, her voice trembling slightly. He has my full confidence, and the boys need him. They need us. She looked pleadingly at Gina. Surely there's something, a grant, a wealthy patron who believes in second chances? Gina's expression hardened. Belief doesn't pay the bills, Mother. I have a meeting with the trustees tomorrow. I need to present a viable plan. Drastic cuts are the only realistic option. Unless, she paused, her gaze becoming calculating. Let's just say certain developments might influence the board's thinking. For instance, if there were concerns raised about the current management, about safety, about the suitability of certain individuals in positions of responsibility. Her eyes flickered almost imperceptibly towards the door of the conservatory, as if expecting someone. Accidents happen, especially in a place as structurally unsound as this. One serious incident, well, it might force the board's hand towards a complete reorganization, or even closure. The implication hung in the dusty air, cold and deliberate. Gina wasn't just talking about financial pressure. She was talking about leveraging a crisis, an accident, an incident, to force the change she wanted. Was she capable of engineering such a thing? Or was she simply cold-bloodedly prepared to exploit one if it occurred? Miss Marple thought of the blood-stained cloth, the ledger entry about Edgar and Lewis. Was Gina aware of the tensions simmering beneath the surface? Was she waiting for them to boil over? Before Miss Marple could respond, the conservatory door creaked open.
Lewis stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a watering can. He moved silently into the room, his eyes fixed on a cluster of orchids in the far corner, seemingly oblivious to the tense conversation. He didn't look at Carrie Louise, Gina, or Miss Marple. He simply began to water the plants, his movements economical, precise. Carrie Louise watched him, a soft, almost maternal look on her face. See, Gina, Lewis, he cares for them. He finds peace here. It proves the boys can find purpose, gentleness. Gina watched Lewis for a moment, her expression unreadable. Gentleness or just following instructions, like a machine programmed to perform a task? She turned back to Carrie Louise. My point stands, Mother. We need a plan, a realistic one. I suggest you start considering what parts of this dream you're willing to sacrifice. She glanced at her watch again. I must prepare for tomorrow. Goodbye, Mother. Miss Marple. She swept out of the conservatory, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken threats and Carrie Louise's quiet despair. Lewis finished watering the orchids. He replaced the can on a stand and finally turned. His pale gray eyes met Carrie Louise's. A fleeting second, something flickered in their depths. Not blankness, but a deep, unsettling intensity. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar impassive mask. He gave a minimal nod, turned, and left as silently as he had come. Carrie Louise sighed, a sound of profound weariness. She doesn't understand, Miss Marple. None of them do. They see only the problems, the costs. They don't see the hearts underneath, the potential for good. Even Lewis, there's goodness in him. I know it. I feel it. Miss Marple thought of the ledger entry, October 19th, E.L., confrontation, LL, threats, and Ruth's fear, and Gina's cold talk of incidents. Potential for good, perhaps, Miss Marple, she said gently, but also perhaps potential for great harm, especially when hearts are conflicted. Carrie Louise stared at her, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. Provoked? By whom? Edgar? He's always watching Lewis, accusing him. Or Gina? She'd do anything to close this place. She clutched her chest. Oh, Miss Marple, what is happening here? What have I done? Before Miss Marple could answer, a shout echoed from the direction of the main house, followed by the sound of a crash and raised voices. Carrie Louise gasped. What now? Miss Marple was already moving towards the door. Stay here, Miss Van Rydock. I'll see. She hurried back into the main corridor. The commotion was coming from near the foot of the grand staircase. A small crowd had gathered, Ruth looking horrified, Emmeline, her face grim, Tommy Bell pressed against the wall, trembling, and two other boys from the rehabilitation wing, wide-eyed and silent. In the center of the chaos stood Edgar Lawson and Lewis.
Chapter 4. Architecture of Illusion, Space as Deception. The aftermath of Edgar and Lewis's violent confrontation hung over Stonygates like a toxic fog. The grand staircase, where the shattered vase had been cleared away, still seemed to vibrate with the echoes of rage. Miss Marple, seeking a moment of clarity away from the oppressive atmosphere of the main house, found herself drawn not towards the neglected gardens, but towards the part of Stonygates that symbolized its decay and potential, the West Wing. Gina Van Rydock stood at the entrance to the wing, a clipboard in hand, her expression a mixture of distaste and cold calculation. She was dressed for practicality in tailored trousers and a sturdy sweater, a stark contrast to her usual immaculate suits. Beside her, looking equally out of place amidst the dust and decay, was Miss Marple. The trustees need a full assessment, Gina stated, her voice clipped as she pushed open a heavy ornate door that groaned in protest. They're considering partial demolition. This wing is structurally unsound, financially draining, and utterly useless in its current state. She gestured Miss Marple inside. Your perspective might be unexpectedly valuable. You notice things others miss. The West Wing was a monument to faded grandeur in terminal decline. Once, it must have housed ballrooms and guest suites. Now, vast chambers lay open to the elements where sections of the roof had collapsed. Sunlight streamed through gaping holes in the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across piles of debris, fallen plaster, shattered furniture, and the skeletal remains of once elegant chandeliers. The air smelled of damp rot, wood smoke from a distant bonfire, and the sharp tang of pigeon droppings. "Useless is perhaps too strong a word, Miss Van Rydock," Miss Marple remarked, her gaze sweeping the cavernous space. "The architecture itself tells a story. Look at the proportions of this room." She pointed towards a vast, ruined salon. "The ceiling height, the placement of the windows, designed to create an illusion of space, of light. Even in ruin, the intent is palpable." "Intent doesn't pay the heating bill," Gina retorted, striding forward, her boots crunching on broken plaster. She stopped before a large, ornate mirror frame hanging crookedly on a remaining section of wall. The glass itself was long gone. "See? Mirrors. They were obsessed with them, used them to make rooms look bigger, to reflect light from inadequate windows. Deception built into the very fabric of the place." She tapped the frame. "This one salvaged might fetch a few pounds from a dealer." She made a note on her clipboard. Miss Marple approached the frame, running a gloved finger along the intricate carving. "Mirrors reflect, Miss Van Rydock, but they also distort. They can be used to create false perspectives, to hide what lies directly behind them." She stepped back, looking past the empty frame into the ruined room beyond. One wonders what this particular mirror was intended to reflect or conceal. Gina frowned. "Conceal? It's just decoration, vanity." "Is it?" Miss Marple gestured towards a section of wall adjacent to where the mirror had hung. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing patches of plaster beneath. But Miss Marple noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible line running vertically, straighter than a crack should be. She stepped closer, peering at it. "This wall, the join is unusually fine, and the plaster texture changes slightly here." She tapped the wall lightly. It sounded hollow. Gina joined her, her professional curiosity momentarily overriding her impatience. Hollow? Could be a cupboard, or more likely just lath and plaster coming away from the studs. This whole wing is rotten. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. She moved along the wall, her eyes scanning the surface. "But the line is too straight, too deliberate." She stopped at a point where a large, faded tapestry hung, partially obscuring the wall. Why cover a structural weakness with a tapestry? Unless... She carefully lifted the heavy fabric. Behind it, set into the wall, was a small, almost invisible door. It was made of the same wood as the paneling, painted over decades ago, blending perfectly. Only the faint outline of the hinges and a tiny recessed keyhole gave it away. Gina's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be! A priest hole! A secret room!" "Or simply a very cleverly disguised storage space," Miss Marple said, examining the keyhole. "Locked, unfortunately." Gina tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. Typical, probably full of moldering linens or useless accounts. She made another note. Add "investigate hidden door" to the list, though I doubt it yields anything of value. She moved away, already scanning the next ruinous chamber. "Come along, Miss Marple. We need to check the roof supports in the ballroom. That's the priority. Safety first." Miss Marple lingered for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the hidden door. It was another layer to Stonygates' deceptive architecture. Another space designed to be overlooked, to conceal its contents. What secrets did it hold? More ledgers? Evidence of past misdeeds? Or simply forgotten junk? The uncertainty was a tantalizing thread in the complex tapestry of illusion. They moved deeper into the wing, navigating treacherous piles of debris. The ballroom was vast and awe-inspiring in its decay. A section of the ornate ceiling had collapsed, leaving a jagged hole open to the gray sky. Rainwater had pooled on the once sprung dance floor, now warped and buckled. Massive roof beams, blackened with age, stretched across the space like the ribs of a dying beast. "See that?" Gina pointed towards a beam running diagonally near the collapsed section. "That's cracked, badly. It's only a matter of time before more comes down. The whole wing is a death trap." She sighed, a rare moment of genuine concern showing through her usual pragmatism. Carrie Louise will be devastated. She always loved this ballroom. Used to imagine hosting grand charity events here. She shook her head. Sentiment. Sentiment often preserves what practicality would discard, Miss Marple observed quietly, looking up at the damaged beam, though in this case practicality seems unavoidable. As they turned to leave the ballroom, a sound echoed through the cavernous space, not the groan of settling timbers, but a rhythmic thump, 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 followed by the scrape of metal on stone. It came from a corridor branching off the far side of the ballroom. "What now?" Gina muttered, heading toward the sound. "More rats, or one of the boys exploring where they shouldn't?" They followed the noise down a narrower, more damaged corridor. The thumping grew louder, more purposeful. It led to a pair of heavy, swinging doors, slightly ajar. Gina pushed one open cautiously. Beyond was a large, high-ceilinged room, surprisingly intact compared to the rest of the wing. It was a workshop of sorts, but not like the modern one Joss Walters ran. This was filled with antiquated equipment. A massive cast-iron treadle lathe, a workbench scarred with centuries of use, racks holding chisels and planes that looked like museum pieces. Sunlight streamed through a large, relatively intact window, illuminating swirling dust motes and casting long, distorted shadows across piles of debris, fallen plaster, shattered furniture, and the skeletal remains of once elegant chandeliers. The air smelled of damp rot, wood smoke from a distant bonfire, and the sharp tang of pigeon droppings. And in the center of the room, his back to them, was Lewis. He was stripped to the waist, revealing a lean, surprisingly muscular frame crisscrossed with old scars. He was using a heavy mallet to drive a chisel into a large block of pale wood, his movements rhythmic, powerful, and utterly focused. Sweat gleamed on his skin. He didn't hear them enter. Gina froze, her hand instinctively going to her throat. Miss Marple placed a restraining hand on her arm, shaking her head slightly. They watched in silence. Lewis wasn't just hacking at the wood. He was shaping it with an almost unnatural precision. The block was slowly transforming into something recognizable, the curved neck and head of a swan. His control over the heavy tools was extraordinary, the mallet falling with consistent force, the chisel biting deep, shaving away precise curls of wood. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. It was the work of a master craftsman, utterly absorbed in his creation. After several minutes, Lewis stopped. He set down the mallet and chisel, picked up a finer carving tool, and began to refine the delicate lines of the swan's beak. His expression, usually so blank and unsettling, was now one of intense concentration, almost peaceful. The dangerous flicker Miss Marple had seen during the confrontation with Edgar was absent, replaced by a profound stillness. Gina stared, her usual composure shattered. I had no idea," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. He's an artist, or a craftsman of exceptional skill. Talent often resides in unexpected places and takes unexpected forms."
As if sensing their presence, Louis stiffened. He slowly turned, his pale gray eyes widening slightly as he saw them. The peaceful concentration vanished instantly, replaced by the familiar guarded watchfulness. He instinctively took a half-step back, placing the workbench between himself and them, his hand hovering near a heavy chisel. "Louis," Gina said, her voice surprisingly steady, though she kept her distance. "We didn't mean to intrude. We were assessing the West Wing." She gestured around the old workshop. This is remarkable. What are you making?" Louis didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered from Gina to Miss Marple, then back to the half-finished swan. He picked up a cloth and carefully wiped wood shavings from its surface. "For Carrie Louise," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "She likes birds. The garden used to have swans." "It's beautiful," Gina said, and there was a surprising sincerity in her tone. "Truly beautiful. Where did you learn to do this?" Louis shrugged, a minimal movement. "Here, the old workshop. Joss showed me things. Books." He gestured vaguely toward a shelf holding dusty volumes on carpentry and carving. "Quiet here. No one bothers." The implication was clear. This hidden workshop, this skill, was his refuge, his sanctuary from the tensions, the accusations, the constant scrutiny of the main house. Here, he wasn't the potential predator, the spy, the disturbed youth. He was simply a craftsman. The realization humanized him in a way nothing else had, making the violence simmering beneath the surface even more tragic and complex. "We won't disturb you further," Gina said, her voice softening further. "Carrie Louise will be deeply moved." She gave a slight nod, then turned and led Miss Marple back out into the corridor, closing the doors gently behind them. Once out of earshot, Gina leaned against the wall, running her hand through her hair. "My God, that changes things." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked, gently. "Or does it simply add another layer, another facet to a very complex young man?" "It changes how we see him," Gina insisted. "He's not just what Edgar says, a blank slate waiting to be filled with darkness. He has passion, skill, a soul, perhaps." She looked troubled. "It makes the confrontation yesterday even more appalling. Edgar goading him like that, and Louis. That stillness, it wasn't just fear, it was control, holding something back. What happens if that control breaks?" "An excellent question, Miss Van Rydock," Miss Marple said quietly. "One we must hope does not find an answer here." They continued their assessment in thoughtful silence, the image of Louis the artist contrasting sharply with the looming danger of the cracked roof beam and the hidden door in the wall. The West Wing was revealing its secrets slowly, each one adding to the intricate deception of Stonygates, its architecture designed to conceal, its inhabitants designed to surprise, and the truth lying buried beneath layers of dust, wood, and carefully constructed illusion. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Joss Walters in the modern workshop. The noise was less chaotic now, the boys focused on individual projects. Joss was supervising Tommy Bell, who was painstakingly fitting a dovetail joint. Joss looked up as Miss Marple approached, wiping his hands on his rag. "Miss Marple, lost again?" he rumbled, though his tone was less gruff than before. "Not lost, Mr. Walters. Seeking information," she replied. "I was in the West Wing earlier. Came across an old workshop, quite well preserved. Louis was there." "Aye, he uses it sometimes. Good place for him, quiet. Lets him work the wood out of his system." He paused, then added gruffly, He's got the gift. Always had. Hands like a surgeon when he's focused. Shame, really. Shame? Joss glanced toward Tommy, who was absorbed in his work, then lowered his voice. Shame that gift gets twisted, or buried. The lad's seen things, done things before he came here. Hard things. Carving wood, it's the only time he looks peaceful, like the bad stuff ain't clawing at him. He shook his head. But the peace don't last, especially not with Edgar breathing down his neck, or Maverick poking around in his head. Dr. Maverick is interested in Lewis's carving, Miss Marple asked, surprised. Interested in anything that gives him a window in, Joss said scornfully. Thinks the carvings are symbolic, represent repressed anger or such nonsense. Asked Lewis to interpret them once. Lewis just stared at him, didn't say a word. Maverick didn't like that. Joss gave a grim chuckle. Lewis don't like being poked. He's like one of those old trapdoor spiders. Sits quiet, waits. Poke him too much. He mimed a snapping motion with his hand. He bites. The image was chillingly apt. And Edgar, does he know about Lewis's skill? Joss snorted. Knows? Of course he knows. Thinks it's another trick, another way Lewis is manipulating Carrie Louise. Look at the poor, damaged boy creating beauty. Joss mimicked Edgar's sneering tone. Edgar only sees the darkness he wants to see, can't comprehend the light. He looked back at Tommy. Like I said, actions speak louder than words. Lewis's actions with wood, they speak of patience, precision, control. But Edgar only hears the shouting. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Joss's perspective was valuable. He saw Lewis not as a villain or a victim, but as a damaged young man navigating a dangerous environment, using his skill as an anchor. It made the potential for violence even more tragic, the loss of control of someone who clearly valued precision and order in his craft. "Thank you, Mr. Walters," she said. "I have much to consider." Joss grunted. "Just keep your eyes open, miss. This place, it twists people. Even the ones trying to do right, especially them." He turned back to Tommy. "Right, lad. That joint's tight enough now. Time for the glue." As Miss Marple left the workshop, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Lewis's mallet in the West Wing workshop seemed to echo in her mind, a counterpoint to the simmering tensions she'd witnessed. It was the sound of creation, of control. But how long could that control withstand the pressures building within Stonygates? That evening, the fragile peace was shattered again, this time by a sound that froze the blood, a tremendous, splintering crack, followed by a deafening roar of collapsing masonry and a scream that was abruptly cut short. The noise came from the West Wing. Miss Marple, who had been returning to the Rose Room after a quiet dinner in her room, was near the entrance to the wing. It wasn't the only one. Gina, who had been working late in the makeshift office near the main hall, appeared at a run. Emmeline Carter came sprinting from the direction of the kitchens, her face pale. Edgar Lawson emerged from his rooms, looking disheveled but instantly alert. Ruth guided a trembling Carrie Louise, who was clutching her chest, her eyes wide open with terror. "What was that? Where did it come from?" Gina demanded, already moving towards the West Wing doors. "The West Wing," Emmeline gasped. "The ballroom. Oh, God, that beam!" They pushed through the doors into the ruined entrance hall of the wing. Dust, thick and choking, filled the air. The sound of settling debris, small stones trickling, wood groaning, echoed ominously. "Stay here," Gina commanded, her voice sharp with authority. "Emmeline, get Carrie Louise back. Miss Marple, stay with them. Edgar, with me. We need to see." Ignoring Gina's order, Miss Marple followed close behind Gina and Edgar, her heart pounding. The dust made it hard to see, but they navigated by memory towards the ballroom. The air grew thicker, the smell of damp plaster and splintered wood overwhelming. They reached the entrance to the ballroom. The sight was horrifying. A massive section of the roof, including the cracked beam Gina had pointed out earlier, had collapsed entirely. It hadn't fallen straight down. It had slid diagonally, crashing down onto the gallery level that ran along one side of the ballroom. Tons of debris, plaster laths, roofing tiles, massive wooden beams filled the space where the gallery had been. Dust hung like a shroud. "Oh my God," Gina whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Edgar stared,
his face ashen. The gallery. Was anyone... A faint, pained groan came from beneath the rubble pile near the edge of the collapse. "Someone's alive!" Edgar shouted, already scrambling forward, heedless of the danger. "Help! We need help!" Gina grabbed his arm. "Edgar, no! It's unstable! We need to get help! Joss! Rope! Timbers!" But Edgar shook her off. "There's no time!" He clambered over a fallen beam, moving carefully but swiftly toward the source of the sound. "Hello? Can you hear me? Hang on!" Miss Marple watched, her mind racing. The collapse. Gina had pointed out the cracked beam. It was a known hazard, but had it simply given way? Or had something, or someone, helped it along? The image of Lewis, the powerful craftsman working with heavy tools and timber in the old workshop, flashed into her mind. And Edgar's immediate assumption that it was an accident. Or was it? Edgar reached the edge of the rubble pile. He started carefully shifting smaller pieces of plaster and wood. "I can see you! Just hold on! We'll get you out!" Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes scanning the devastation, looking for clues amidst the chaos. Something glinted near Edgar's feet, half buried in the dust. She moved carefully, keeping her balance on the uneven debris. It was a heavy-duty steel chisel, the kind used for splitting timber or masonry. The tip was coated with fresh splinters of wood and plaster dust. And etched into the handle, almost worn smooth, but still visible, were two small, crudely carved initials. L.L.
Chapter 5. The Psychology of Perception. How Christie Plays with Our Minds. The dust still hung in the air of the West Wing like a spectral shroud, thick enough to taste, gritty on the tongue. Beneath the groaning timbers and the chilling silence where the scream had been cut short, a new sound emerged. The ragged, desperate gasps of Edgar Lawson as he clawed at the mountain of debris. Miss Marple stood frozen, the cold steel of the chisel heavy in her gloved hand, the initials L.L. burning against her palm like a brand. Gina Van Rydock, her usual composure shattered, barked orders into a portable telephone she'd produced from her handbag, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Joss, get ropes, timbers, anything, now, and get an ambulance. The West Wing ballroom, collapse. We have a casualty." She listened for a second, then snapped, "Just move." She turned back to the devastation, her eyes scanning the precarious pile of rubble where Edgar worked. "Edgar, be careful! It's still shifting." Edgar didn't look up. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his movements frantic yet precise. "I can see his hand. Just a little more." He heaved aside a heavy chunk of plasterboard, revealing more of the trapped figure. A leg, twisted at an unnatural angle. A shoulder, pinned beneath a massive roof beam. "It's Maverick!" Edgar yelled, his voice cracking. "It's Dr. Maverick!" Miss Marple's breath hitched. Dr. Maverick, the architect of the controversial treatments, the keeper of secrets, the man Lewis had silently defied. The chisel in her hand suddenly felt incriminatingly heavy. Lewis's chisel, found at the scene. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Lewis hated Maverick. Lewis had access. Lewis possessed the skill. The collapse was no accident. It was murder. Gina paled further. Maverick. Oh, God. She took a step forward, then stopped, her practicality warring with horror. Is he alive? Edgar grunted, straining against the beam. Barely. Pulse is faint. We need to get this off him now. He looked around frantically. Miss Marple, that timber, the one leaning against the wall. Help me. Miss Marple moved instinctively, pocketing the chisel. Together, they maneuvered a long, relatively intact wooden beam towards the wreckage. Using it as a lever, Edgar wedged it under the massive roof beam, pinning Maverick. With a guttural roar of effort, he threw his weight on the lever. The beam groaned, shifted slightly. Maverick let out a low moan. Again! Edgar shouted. Miss Marple added her weight, though it was minimal compared to his. The beam shifted another inch. It was agonizingly slow. Here, Joss is coming, Emmeline Carter's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. She appeared at the ballroom entrance, followed by Joss Walters, who carried a coil of thick rope and a long crowbar. Behind them, Ruth supported a nearly fainting Carrie Louise. Carrie Louise, no! Gina cried out. Get her out of here! But Carrie Louise had seen the trapped figure. Alistair, she whispered, her voice thin with disbelief and terror. Alistair Maverick? Is he... What happened? Stay back, Mrs. Van Rydock, Joss boomed, moving swiftly to Edgar's side. He took the lever from Miss Marple. Let me, Edgar. You're done in. He positioned himself, his powerful muscles bunching. Ready? On 3. 1, 2, 3. With a mighty heave, Joss forced the lever down. The massive roof beam shifted upwards with a grinding protest, creating a crucial gap. Edgar immediately reached into the space, grabbing Maverick's shoulders and pulling with desperate strength. With a final sickening lurch, he dragged the doctor free, dragging him clear just as the lever slipped, and the beam crashed back down with a thunderous roar, sending another shower of dust and smaller debris raining down. Maverick lay sprawled on the dusty floor, groaning. His face was ashen, smeared with blood and dirt. One arm was clearly broken, bent at a sickening angle. His breathing was shallow, ragged. A deep gash on his forehead oozed blood. Get the ambulance, Gina screamed into the phone. Tell them it's critical. Head trauma, possible internal injuries, broken bones. Move! She knelt beside Maverick, her clinical training momentarily overriding her shock. She checked his pulse, peered into his unfocused eyes. Alistair, can you hear me? Alistair! Maverick's eyes fluttered open, wide with pain and confusion. He tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle emerged. He looked past Gina, his gaze fixing on Miss Marple with startling intensity. He lifted his uninjured hand, trembling violently, pointing a shaky finger not towards the wreckage, but towards the gallery where the collapse had originated. His lips moved, forming a single, almost silent word, before his eyes rolled back and he slipped into unconsciousness. Lewis. The name hung in the dusty air, a dying accusation. Miss Marple felt a chill crawl up her spine. Had Maverick seen Lewis, seen him tampering with the beam, or was it simply the name of the person he most feared, the person he knew would be blamed? The perception was everything, and right now the perception pointed squarely at Lewis.
The makeshift infirmary was one of the few intact rooms in the East Wing, usually reserved for minor ailments among the boys. Now it felt like a scene from a battlefield. Dr. Maverick lay unnaturally still on a narrow cot, his broken arm splinted, his head bandaged, an intravenous drip snaking into his good arm. The district doctor, a flustered man named Dr. Evans, had stabilized him as best he could before the ambulance arrived to whisk him away to the county hospital. His prognosis was guarded. Severe concussion, multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. He might not survive. Carrie Louise sat hunched in a hard chair beside the cot, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. Ruth hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her face etched with fear and exhaustion. Gina stood by the window, staring out at the darkening grounds, her posture rigid, her profile unreadable.
Emmeline Carter moved quietly, efficiently, clearing away used medical supplies, her expression grim. Edgar Lawson slumped against the wall, his head in his hands, dust still matting his hair. Miss Marple observed them all, the chisel, a cold weight in her pocket, the echo of Maverick's whisper, "Lewis," reverberating in her mind. The silence was broken by the arrival of Inspector Davies, a solid, unassuming man in his 50s with kind eyes that missed nothing. He'd been called by Gina immediately after the collapse. He nodded curtly to the room. "Mrs. Van Rydock, Miss Marple," he acknowledged. "Terrible business. Dr. Evans gave me a preliminary report before they left. Critical condition." He looked around the room. "I'll need statements from everyone who was present at the time of the collapse or who arrived shortly after. And I'll need to see the site itself once it's deemed safe." "Of course, Inspector," Gina said, her voice clipped and professional. She moved away from the window. "I can provide a timeline. Miss Marple, Edgar, Emmeline, and I were near the entrance to the West Wing when we heard the collapse. We entered immediately. Edgar and Miss Marple reached the ballroom first. Edgar began rescue efforts. I called for help. Joss and Emmeline arrived shortly after with equipment. Ruth brought Carrie Louise." "And Dr. Maverick?" Davies asked, his gaze lingering on the unconscious man. "What was he doing in the West Wing, particularly the ballroom, which I understand was structurally unsound?" Gina hesitated for a fraction of a second. He often walked, to think. He found the quiet of the ruined parts conducive. He mentioned the West Wing's acoustics once, said the silence was different there. It sounded plausible, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening around Gina's eyes. Was she protecting Maverick's reputation or concealing something else? "Conducive to what, exactly?" Davies pressed gently. "His work, Inspector," Carrie Louise spoke up, her voice hoarse from crying. She lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "Alistair was dedicated, brilliant. He needed space to process his theories, his observations about the boys. The West Wing, it was his sanctuary, like Lewis has his workshop." Her voice broke on Lewis's name. "Speaking of Lewis," Davies said, his tone neutral but attentive, "where is the young man? I understand he resides here." No one spoke immediately. The silence stretched, thick with implication. "He's not here," Emmeline finally stated, her voice flat. "No one's seen him since before the collapse." Davies's eyebrows rose slightly. "Not seen him. That's, unfortunate timing, isn't it? Given Dr. Maverick's condition and the circumstances." He looked directly at Miss Marple. "You found something at the scene, Miss Marple? I understand you were one of the first there." All eyes turned to her. Miss Marple felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken accusation already forming. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her pocket and drew out the chisel. She held it out, the initials LL clearly visible in the dim light. "I found this," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Partially buried in the debris near the edge of the collapse, close to where Dr. Maverick was trapped." Inspector Davies took the chisel, handling it carefully with a handkerchief. He examined the initials, the fresh splinters of wood and plaster dust on the tip. "LL," he murmured. "Lewis." He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room. "And this chisel? It's the type used for heavy carpentry, masonry work?" "It's a splitter," Joss Walters spoke up from the doorway where he'd been standing, unobserved. "Used to force timber apart or split stone. Heavy duty. Needs strength to use effectively." He looked at Davies. "Lewis has one. Identical.
Uses it in the West Wing workshop sometimes for shaping big blocks of wood. The implication was undeniable. Lewis had the tool. Lewis had the strength. Lewis had the skill. Lewis had the motive, his hatred of Maverick's treatments, his fear of exposure. Lewis had the opportunity. He was missing, and Lewis had been named by the victim. The perception was complete, a circle of damning evidence drawn around the absent young man. Carrie Louise let out a choked sob. No, no, Lewis wouldn't. He couldn't. He was carving a swan for me. He has goodness in him. Goodness can be twisted, Mrs. Van Rydock, Inspector Davies said, gently but firmly, especially under pressure, especially when someone feels threatened or manipulated. He tucked the chisel into an evidence bag. I'll need to speak to Lewis when he's found, and I'll need a thorough search of his belongings, particularly his workshop. Turned to Gina. Miss Van Rydock, perhaps you could show me the West Wing site now, before light fails completely. Of course, Inspector, Gina agreed, her expression unreadable. She shot a brief, unreadable glance at Miss Marple before following Davies out. The room descended into a heavier silence. Carrie Louise's sobs were the only sound. Edgar finally looked up, his face haggard. It makes sense, he said, his voice rough. All of it. The hatred, the skill, the chisel, his disappearance. He finally snapped. Maverick pushed him too far. We all saw it coming. Edgar, Ruth gasped. How can you say that? Carrie Louise is distraught. It's the truth, Ruth. Edgar pushed himself off the wall, his agitation returning. We all knew Lewis was dangerous. We all saw the potential for violence. Carrie Louise refused to see it. Maverick refused to see it. And now, he gestured helplessly towards the empty cot. Perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through Edgar's outburst, we should be cautious about what we think we see, Mr. Lawson. Perception can be a deceptive tool, especially when emotions run high. Edgar rounded at her. What's that supposed to mean? The evidence is clear. The chisel, Maverick's accusation, Lewis running away.
Running away? Miss Marple echoed softly. Or perhaps hiding? From the accusation? From the blame? Or perhaps, she added, her gaze sweeping the room, from whoever really caused that collapse? The suggestion hung in the air, unexpected and unsettling. Who else had motive? Gina, with her desire to close Stonygates? Edgar himself, whose obsession with Lewis bordered on the pathological? Ruth, fiercely protective of Carrie Louise? Emmeline, with her practical grip on the estate's finances? Even Joss, who despised Maverick's methods? The web of relationships suddenly seemed infinitely more complex, the potential for deception woven into every strand. Darkness had fallen completely by the time Inspector Davies finished his preliminary examination of the collapsed site. Floodlights had been set up, casting long, distorted shadows across the ruined ballroom, turning the devastation into a grotesque theater set. Davies stood near the edge of the rubble pile, speaking quietly with the police photographer. Gina stood a little apart, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the devastation. Miss Marple, unable to rest, had quietly slipped away from the infirmary and now stood observing from the shadows of the ballroom entrance. The chisel was gone, bagged as evidence. But Miss Marple's mind was not on the physical evidence. It was on the psychology of the scene, on the perception of guilt that had already settled on Lewis like a shroud. She watched Davies. He was methodical, careful. He examined the point where the cracked beam had given way, tracing the line of fracture. He noted the position of the debris, the way it had fallen. He was looking for facts, for physical proof. But Miss Marple knew that in a place like Stonygates, in a situation this volatile, facts could be manipulated. Perception was often the more powerful weapon. Her gaze drifted to Gina.
The woman's profile was stark against the glare of the floodlights. She looked exhausted, yes, but also thoughtful, calculating. Miss Marple recalled Gina's words in the conservatory. Unless something changes dramatically, accidents happen. One serious incident might force the board's hand towards a complete reorganization, or even closure. The collapse was certainly a serious incident. Maverick was a key figure in the controversial program Gina wanted to dismantle. His removal, whether accidental or otherwise, would certainly constitute a dramatic change. Did Gina's shock mask a cold satisfaction? Was her efficiency now part of a cover-up, or was Miss Marple simply seeing shadows because the light was so poor? Davies finished his instructions to the photographer and walked over to Gina. "We'll seal off the West Wing completely tonight, Miss Van Rydock. Forensics will be here first light. They'll go over this inch by inch." He paused. "Dr. Maverick, if he regains consciousness, his testimony will be crucial. Did he say anything else to you before he passed out?" "Only the name, Inspector. Lewis. He was delirious, in pain. It could have meant anything." "Or it could have meant exactly what it sounded like," Davies said evenly. "We'll find him, Miss Van Rydock, one way or another." Gina gave a curt nod. "Of course, Inspector. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on Carrie Louise and make arrangements for the night. This has been disruptive." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the vast ruined space. Miss Marple remained in the shadows as Davies conferred with his sergeant. Her mind raced. The perception of Lewis's guilt was overwhelming, built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and a dying man's whisper. But perception, she knew from a lifetime of observing human nature, was notoriously unreliable. It was shaped by prejudice, by fear, by desire. Edgar wanted Lewis to be guilty. It validated his obsession. Ruth feared Lewis was guilty. It confirmed her worst nightmares about the boys. Emmeline refused to see Lewis as guilty. It protected her fragile faith. Gina's perception was the most opaque. Did she want Lewis to be guilty? Or did she want someone else to be? Or did she simply want the incident to serve her purpose, regardless of the truth? Miss Marple thought of the hidden door in the West Wing wall, of the secret workshop where Lewis found solace, of the ledger with its cryptic entries, of the blood-stained cloth. Each piece was a fragment of reality, but how they fit together depended entirely on the lens through which they were viewed, the lens of perception. She needed to see Lewis, needed to hear his side, but more than that, she needed to understand the why behind the collapse, not just the physical how, but the psychological motivation. Who stood to gain? Who stood to lose? And who had the skill, not just with wood and tools, but with manipulation and misdirection, to turn perception into a weapon? As Davies and his men began securing the scene, Miss Marple slipped away, melting back into the dim corridors of the main house. She needed to think, to piece together the fragments before the perception of Lewis's guilt became an unshakable reality. The masterclass in deception wasn't just in the physical setting of Stonygates. It was in the minds of its inhabitants, in the way they saw each other, in the stories they told themselves about what was possible and what was not. And Miss Marple suspected that the truth, like the hidden door in the wall, was concealed not by bricks and mortar, but by layers of carefully constructed illusion. The real question wasn't just who caused the collapse, but who had orchestrated the perception of guilt that now threatened to consume Lewis whole. The answer, she felt, with chilling certainty, lay not in the ruins of the ballroom, but in the intricate, deceptive architecture of the human heart.
Chapter 6. Reflections of Truth, the Central Role of Mirrors. The dawn that broke over Stonygates was a sullen, bruised purple, offering no comfort, only casting the sprawling estate in sharper, more unforgiving relief. Inside the main house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken dread. Inspector Davies had departed in the early hours, leaving behind a skeletal constable to guard the sealed west wing and a palpable sense of impending doom. Lewis remained vanished, a ghost haunting the periphery of every conversation, his name spoken only in whispers thick with accusation or disbelief. Miss Marple, however, found no solace in her room. The chisel might be gone, bagged as evidence, but its weight lingered in her mind, a physical manifestation of the trap closing around Lewis. She needed to think, to see beyond the obvious reflection of guilt that had been so meticulously constructed. Her feet carried her, almost unconsciously, not towards the chaotic heart of the house, but back towards the west wing. Not the ruined ballroom, but the place where Lewis had sought refuge, the old workshop. The constable stationed at the main entrance to the wing eyed her with weary suspicion. "Sorry, ma'am, inspector's orders. No one enters." "Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "I am not entering the sealed area. I merely wish to observe the exterior of the old workshop building, from a safe distance. It may hold contextual clues." She gestured towards a narrow path that ran alongside the west wing, leading towards the rear where the workshop stood, separate from the main collapsed structure. The constable hesitated, then shrugged. "Long as you don't touch anything, ma'am, and stay clear of the ballroom entrance." Miss Marple nodded her thanks and followed the path. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The old workshop stood intact, a small, sturdy brick building nestled against the thicker walls of the west wing. Its windows were grimy but unbroken. As she approached, she noticed something she hadn't seen clearly the day before: a small, high window on the side facing the main ballroom. It was positioned perfectly to look into the gallery level where the collapse had originated. A cold prickle traced her spine. A vantage point. A place to watch unseen. She moved closer, peering through the grimy glass. Inside, the workshop was much as she remembered: the lathe, the workbenches, the shelves of tools and books, and there, on the central bench, bathed in the weak morning light filtering through the main window, stood the half-finished swan. Lewis's creation. It looked achingly vulnerable, its graceful neck emerging from the rough block, a symbol of fragile beauty amidst the surrounding chaos. But it was what lay beneath the workbench that caught her eye. Tucked away, almost hidden in the shadows, was a large rectangular object covered by a dusty canvas sheet. It looked out of place. Curiosity overriding caution, Miss Marple tried the workshop door. It was unlocked. She slipped inside, the familiar scent of wood shavings and old oil filling her nostrils. She approached the covered object. Carefully, she lifted the canvas. It was a mirror. Not the grand gilded monstrosity from the cellar, but a large, plain, floor-standing mirror, perhaps 8 feet tall, in a simple dark wood frame. It was dusty but intact. Its surface reflected the workshop, the half-finished swan, the shelves of tools and books, and Miss Marple herself, a small, white-haired figure looking back with wide eyes. Why was it here, hidden? Lewis's mirror? Or someone else's? She stepped closer, examining the frame. It was sturdy, unadorned. Then she noticed something odd. Along the bottom edge of the frame, almost invisible against the dark wood, were small, neatly drilled holes. Peering through one, she saw they ran straight through to the back. Ventilation? Or something else? She moved around to the back of the mirror. The wood was plain, unmarked. Except, near the top right corner, etched faintly into the wood, almost worn away, was a small symbol. It looked like a stylized M intertwined with a cross. Miss Marple frowned. Where had she seen that before? Then it clicked. On the spine of one of the books in Dr. Maverick's office. His personal monogram. Maverick. Maverick's mirror. Hidden in Lewis's workshop. The implications were staggering. Why would Maverick hide a mirror here? To observe Lewis? To spy on his only sanctuary? Or for something else entirely? The drilled holes. They weren't for ventilation. They were too small, too precise. They looked like viewing ports. A sudden noise outside. The crunch of boots on gravel made her freeze. She quickly replaced the canvas, smoothing it down, and slipped out of the workshop just as Gina Van Rydock came around the corner of the path, followed by a grim-faced Emmeline Carter. "Miss Marple," Gina said, her voice sharp with surprise. "What are you doing here?" The inspector said, "Merely observing the exterior," Miss Van Rydock replied, smoothly, gesturing towards the workshop. Considering the proximity, it seemed relevant. Gina's eyes narrowed slightly, then flickered towards the workshop door. Relevant? How? She stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the building. Lewis's bolt hole, where he crafted his distractions. Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the intensity in her eyes. Distractions, Miss Marple echoed, or expressions. The swan he was carving showed remarkable skill and focus. Focus can be a weapon, Miss Marple said flatly, especially when combined with resentment and opportunity. We found Lewis's personal effects in his room. Amongst other things, she paused, pulling a small notebook from her pocket, his journal, passages filled with hatred for Maverick, descriptions of the West Wing structure, detailed notes on load-bearing walls and weak points. She flipped it open, reading aloud. Maverick's weakness is his belief in his own control. The gallery beam is cracked. It wouldn't take much. A precise pressure point. A wedge. A splitter. Like the one I use for the oak blocks. He wouldn't see it coming. Reflections can hide the truth. Gina snapped the notebook shut. Damning, wouldn't you say? The passage was chilling. It spoke of premeditation, of knowledge, of the very chisel found at the scene. It painted a picture of Lewis as a cold, calculating killer. But Miss Marple's mind raced. Reflections can hide the truth. Had Lewis written that? Or had someone else written it in his journal? And the mirror, Maverick's mirror, hidden here, reflections. Damning, circumstantially, Miss Marple said carefully, but journals can be interpreted or altered. And the phrase about reflections, it's rather poetic for a carpentry note. Poetic or not, it fits the evidence, Gina insisted. The chisel, the opportunity, the disappearance, the victim's accusation, the journal. She looked towards the sealed West Wing. Davies will have a warrant for Lewis's arrest the moment he's found, if he's found alive. Emmeline, who had been silent, spoke up, her voice rough. He won't get far, Gina. Not on foot. Not in this weather. We've got men searching the woods and the old quarry. She looked at Miss Marple, her expression unreadable. You seem unconvinced, Miss Marple. I am unconvinced by certainty, Miss Marple replied, especially when it arrives so quickly, so neatly tied. The truth is rarely so convenient. Convenient? Gina's voice rose slightly. A man is fighting for his life. Stonygates is under siege. And you talk of convenience? I talk of perception, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but carrying weight. We perceive Lewis's guilt because the evidence presented points to him. But who presented it? Who found the journal? Who ensured the chisel was discovered? Who heard Maverick's whisper? Perception is a powerful tool. It can be shaped, manipulated, like light reflected in a mirror. Gina stared at her, a flicker of something. Suspicion? Respect? In her eyes. Are you suggesting someone framed Lewis? Who? Edgar? He hated Lewis, but he wouldn't kill Maverick.
Ruth? She is devoted to Carrie Louise. Emmeline? She runs this place practically. Joss? He despised Maverick's methods, but he's no murderer. Me? She gave a harsh laugh. I wanted changes, yes, but not this. Not blood. The list of those with motive is not short, Miss Van Rydock, Miss Marple said gently. Maverick held power. He knew secrets. His treatments were controversial. His removal, accidental or otherwise, serves different agendas. She looked towards the workshop again. The mirror. It belongs to Maverick. Why was it hidden here? To observe Lewis, or to create an illusion? Gina followed her gaze, her brow furrowed. Maverick's mirror? Here? How do you know? The monogram. On the frame, Miss Marple said. And the drilled holes. They look like viewing ports. To observe without being seen. To manipulate perception. Gina's face paled slightly. Viewing ports? Good God! He was spying. On Lewis. On who else? She looked genuinely disturbed. But that doesn't exonerate Lewis. It just makes Maverick more manipulative. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. Or perhaps it provides an alternative perspective, a different reflection. She needed to see that mirror again, to understand its purpose. If you'll excuse me, ladies, I believe the morning air has chilled me sufficiently. She turned and walked back towards the main house, her mind whirling. The mirror was the key, Maverick's mirror, hidden in Lewis's sanctuary, used to spy or used to deceive. Later that morning, Miss Marple found Ruth Van Rydock in the small, cluttered sitting room adjacent to Carrie Louise's bedroom. Carrie Louise herself was resting, sedated by Dr. Evans after her hysterics the previous night. Ruth was attempting to mend a tear in an old curtain, her hands trembling so badly she kept pricking her finger with the needle. "Ruth, my dear," Miss Marple said, softly entering the room, "allow me." She took the needle and thread from Ruth's unresisting hands and began to stitch with neat, economical movements. Ruth sank into a chair, looking utterly defeated. "Thank you, Jane. I'm not myself. This whole terrible business. Alistair, Lewis," she shuddered. "Carrie Louise is broken. She truly believed in Lewis, in his goodness. To think he could do such a thing, it's destroyed her. Or perhaps destroyed her perception of him," Miss Marple said suggestively, keeping her eyes on her stitching. "Perception, Ruth. We perceive what we are shown, what we expect to see. Edgar expects Lewis to be violent, so he sees only the threat. Carrie Louise expects goodness, so she refuses to see the danger. Gina sees an obstacle to her plans, so she sees a convenient culprit. You see a threat to Carrie Louise's peace, so you see the monster the evidence paints. And what do you see, Jane?" Ruth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Marple finished the stitch and bit off the thread. She looked directly at Ruth. "I see inconsistencies. I see a mirror hidden where it shouldn't be. I see a journal entry that reads like a confession, but feels like a performance. I see a young man whose only refuge was violated by the very man he is accused of trying to kill." She paused. "I see someone who might have used Lewis's hatred, his skill, his very presence as a smokescreen. Someone who understood how reflections work." Ruth stared at her, confusion warring with dawning horror. A smokescreen? Who? Who would do such a thing? And why? "Who stood to gain the most from Maverick's removal?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Not just Stonygates closing, Ruth. Who knew Maverick's darkest secrets? Who feared exposure? Who had the intelligence to orchestrate such a complex deception? Who had access to Lewis's journal, to his workshop, to the West Wing itself?" Ruth's face went deathly white. She clutched the arms of her chair. "No, no, you can't mean... Gina? But she
She was horrified. She called the ambulance. She's helping the police. Helping them perceive the truth she wants them to see, Miss Marple said softly. Gina is brilliant, Ruth, ruthlessly pragmatic. She identified the problem, Maverick and his expensive, controversial program blocking her plans for the trust. She identified the perfect weapon, Lewis's simmering resentment and his skill. She identified the perfect stage, the decaying West Wing. She needed a catalyst, a way to trigger the collapse without being seen herself. A mirror. Ruth gasped. The mirror? Maverick's mirror? With the viewing ports? Precisely, Miss Marple nodded. Imagine, Ruth, Gina, knowing Maverick's habit of walking the West Wing, perhaps even knowing he planned to confront Lewis that day. She places the mirror in Lewis's workshop beforehand. She uses the viewing ports to observe. She waits. Maverick arrives. Perhaps he and Lewis argue. Lewis, in a rage, picks up his chisel, maybe even threatens Maverick with it. Gina sees her chance. From the safety of the workshop, using the mirror's reflection to see the precise angle, she uses a long tool, perhaps a metal rod or even another chisel inserted through the viewing port, to apply precise pressure to the cracked beam from the gallery side. A small targeted push, exploiting the weakness Lewis himself had noted in his journal. The beam collapses. Maverick is trapped. Gina rushes out, playing the horrified witness. She finds Lewis's journal conveniently open to the incriminating page. She ensures the chisel is discovered near Maverick. She hears Maverick's delirious whisper, Lewis, and lets everyone believe it's an accusation, not perhaps a warning or a name spoken in confusion. Lewis, terrified, flees. The perception of his guilt is complete. Ruth stared, speechless, her mind struggling to grasp the cold, calculated brutality of the scenario. But the mirror! How could she be sure it would work? The angle, the pressure. Geometry, Ruth, and opportunity. Gina is meticulous. She would have calculated the angles, the weak points. The mirror allowed her to see the exact spot to strike without being seen herself. It was the perfect instrument of deception, a reflection that hid the truth. But why hide the mirror afterwards? Why leave it there? Whispered Ruth. Because it was too dangerous to move, too risky to be caught with it. And perhaps it was part of the misdirection. If found, it would seem to implicate Maverick's spying, reinforcing the narrative of conflict between him and Lewis, further cementing Lewis's motive. Gina gambled it wouldn't be found, or if it was, it would be misinterpreted. Ruth buried her face in her hands. Oh, Jane, if this is true, if Gina is capable of such calculated evil, what do we do? We have no proof, only your theory. The police have Lewis's journal, the chisel, Maverick's word.
We have the mirror, Miss Marple said, her voice firming, and we have its placement, and we have the drilled holes. They are too precise for ventilation. They are for observation, for manipulation. That is physical evidence. And we have the inconsistency in Gina's actions, her prior knowledge of the structural weakness, her immediate focus on Lewis, her convenient discovery of the journal. She stood up. We need to show Inspector Davies, but first we need to secure the mirror, before Gina realizes we know. Ruth looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and resolve. How? The workshop is near the sealed area. The constable. Leave that to me, Ruth, Miss Marple said, a steely glint in her mild eyes. Distraction is a useful tool, especially when the target is overconfident. She patted Ruth's hand. Stay with Carrie Louise, keep her calm, and be ready. The reflection is about to shatter. Miss Marple found Gina in the small office she'd commandeered near the main hall, surrounded by ledgers and financial reports. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her expression coolly inquisitive. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was wondering, Miss Van Rydock, about the structural reports on the West Wing, specifically the gallery beam. Inspector Davies mentioned it was a known hazard. Who first identified the specific crack?" Gina's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I did. During my initial assessment for the trustees, I noted it in my report." "Why?" "It's just that Lewis's journal entry mentioned it too. The gallery beam is cracked. It suggests he had access to that information, or perhaps saw the report itself." Gina stiffened slightly. "The report was confidential, locked in my files. Lewis wouldn't have had access." She paused, then added dismissively, "He could have observed the crack himself, I suppose. He spent enough time skulking around the West Wing." "Skulking?" Miss Marple echoed. "Or working? In his workshop, which I understand has a rather unique feature." She watched Gina's face intently. "Unique? It's an old workshop, Miss Marple. Dusty, full of junk." "Not entirely junk," Miss Marple said softly. "It contains a rather large mirror, tucked away under a workbench. A mirror with viewing ports drilled in the frame. A mirror bearing Dr. Maverick's monogram." The color drained from Gina's face. It was a fleeting reaction, quickly masked, but Miss Marple saw it, the crack in the reflection. I have no idea what you're talking about. A mirror in Lewis's workshop? Preposterous." "Is it, Miss Marple? A mirror that allows someone to observe the gallery area unseen, to see the precise point to apply pressure, to trigger a collapse while appearing to be elsewhere? A mirror that becomes the perfect murder weapon?" Gina stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd. You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple. The evidence against Lewis is overwhelming. You're letting sentiment for Carrie Louise cloud your judgment." "Sentiment has nothing to do with it, Miss Van Rydock. Logic does. The logic of opportunity. The logic of motive. The logic of a mind brilliant enough to perceive how to turn Lewis's own darkness into a shield for her own actions. You used his hatred, Ruth. You used his skill. You used his workshop. You used his journal. You used the mirror. You turned perception into a weapon. But mirrors reflect both ways, don't they? They can also reveal the truth." Gina's facade finally cracked. Fear and fury warred in her eyes. "You have no proof, just wild accusations. The police will never believe you. They have Lewis's journal, his chisel." "They have a mirror," Miss Marple said steadily, "with viewing ports, placed strategically. And they have the testimony of someone who saw you near the workshop that morning, before the collapse." It was a gamble, a bluff. Ruth hadn't seen her, but the flicker in Gina's eyes suggested she might have been seen by someone else, perhaps a boy, perhaps Joss. Gina flinched. Who saw me?" "Does it matter?" Miss Marple asked softly. "The reflection is broken, Gina. The illusion is failing. The truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. It can't be hidden forever." Gina stared at her, trapped. The brilliant, ruthless facade crumbled, revealing the desperate, calculating mind beneath. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, perhaps to confess, perhaps to threaten. At that moment the door burst open. Inspector Davies stood there, his face grim, a uniformed sergeant beside him. Behind them, looking pale but very much alive, stood Lewis. His clothes were torn and muddy, his face scratched, but his eyes were clear and fixed on Gina with an unnerving intensity. "Miss Van Rydock," Inspector Davies said, his voice heavy with authority, "we found Lewis, hiding in the old quarry. He has quite a story to tell. About seeing you near the workshop that morning, about hearing a metallic scraping sound from inside just before the collapse, and about finding his journal open on his workbench yesterday afternoon when he was certain he'd left it locked in his room."
Gina swayed, her hand flying to her throat. Her gaze darted from Lewis's accusing stare to Miss Marple's calm, knowing eyes, to the implacable face of Inspector Davies. The mirror had done its work. It had reflected the truth, and the reflection was devastating. The art of illusion had reached its climax. The masterclass in deception was over. The final shattering reflection revealed not Lewis, the broken craftsman, but Gina, the architect of ruin, caught in the merciless light of her own meticulously crafted downfall.
Chapter 7. Time's Illusion, Manipulating Chronology to Deceive. The silence in Gina Van Rydok's makeshift office was not empty. It was thick, viscous, heavy with the weight of shattered illusions and the acrid scent of betrayal. Inspector Davies stood like a monolith of authority, his gaze fixed on the woman who had moments before radiated icy control. Lewis, mud-streaked and wild-eyed but undeniably present, leaned against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged gasps as if he'd run all the way from the quarry. Miss Marple observed the tableau, her mind already piecing together the fractured timeline that Gina had so meticulously manipulated. "Ms. Van Rydok," Davies began, his voice low and dangerously calm. "Lewis here tells a rather compelling story. He claims he saw you entering the old workshop early yesterday morning, hours before the collapse. He also states he heard a distinct metallic scraping sound from within just moments before the beam gave way, and, most significantly," Davies paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "he insists his journal was locked in his room yesterday afternoon, yet it was found open on his workbench this morning. Turn to that damning page. Care to explain?" Gina's composure, her armor of ruthless pragmatism, had fractured. But it wasn't despair that filled the cracks. It was a cold, simmering fury. She drew herself up, her chin lifting, her eyes, once calculating, now burning with a fierce, almost manic light. "Explain," she repeated, her voice surprisingly steady, though it held a brittle edge. "Very well, Inspector, since you seem determined to listen to the ramblings of a disturbed boy and the fantasies of an old woman." She shot Miss Marple a venomous glance. "Yes, I was at the workshop, early. I needed to assess the structural integrity of that entire wing for the trustees. The workshop adjoins the ballroom gallery. I was examining the wall from the outside." Her lie was delivered with practiced ease. "As for the scraping sound, Lewis is mistaken or lying. The only sound I heard was the wind whistling through the broken windows upstairs. And his journal?" She gave a dismissive sniff. "He's forgetful, hysterical. He probably left it open himself, then panicked when he realized what he'd written. The boy is unstable, Inspector, dangerous. His obsession with Maverick is well documented. He finally snapped." "Liar!" Lewis pushed himself off the doorframe, his voice raw but clear. He took a step into the room, his pale gray eyes locked onto Gina. "You weren't outside. You were inside the workshop. I saw you through the crack in the door. You were doing something to that big mirror, the one covered up. I saw you bend over it. Then I heard the scrape, like metal on wood. Then the crash." He shuddered, wrapping himself in his arms. "I ran. I was scared. Scared you'd see me. Scared they'd blame me. They always blame me." Gina's lip curled in a sneer. "Convenient, isn't it? You run, hide like the coward you are, then concoct this story to save your own skin? Pathetic. Pathetic?" Ms. Marple spoke for the first time, her quiet voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Or perhaps, Ms. Van Rydok, it is simply the truth. A truth that disrupts your carefully constructed timeline." She stepped forward, addressing Davies. "Inspector, consider the sequence of events as presented by the evidence against Lewis.
Lewis writes the incriminating journal entry before the collapse. He takes his chisel to the west wing. He sabotages the beam. The collapse occurs. Maverick is trapped. Lewis flees. The chisel is found. The journal is found. Lewis disappears. A neat, linear narrative pointing squarely at him. She paused, letting the logic sink in. But Lewis's testimony and the presence of the mirror introduce a critical disruption. Gina was seen inside the workshop before the collapse. The scraping sound was heard immediately before the collapse. The journal was not open when Lewis last saw it, but was open when it was discovered later. This suggests the journal was accessed after Lewis fled the scene. The timeline isn't linear at all. It's been manipulated. Events have been reordered to create a false sequence of cause and effect. Davies nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Go on, Ms. Marple." "Gina needed the collapse to happen," Ms. Marple continued, her gaze never leaving Gina's furious face. "She needed Maverick removed. She needed a scapegoat. Lewis was perfect. She knew his resentment, his skill, his familiarity with the West Wing's weaknesses. She likely obtained access to his journal beforehand, perhaps when he was working in the main house, perhaps through a duplicate key. She read his private thoughts, his anger towards Maverick, his knowledge of the cracked beam. She saw the blueprint for her plan." "She didn't just read it," Lewis whispered, his voice gaining strength. She wrote that last part, about the beam, about the splitter, about reflections hiding the truth. That wasn't me. I write about the wood, about the feel of it, about wanting to be left alone, not about killing." He looked at Davies, pleading. "Check it, Inspector. Check the handwriting, the ink, the last page. It's different, smudged, written faster, angrier, not mine." Davies' eyes widened slightly. He turned to Gina. "The journal, Ms. Van Rydock. Where is it now?" Gina's composure finally cracked completely. Panic flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by defiance. "I don't have it. It's evidence. It was bagged." "Was it?" Ms. Marple asked softly. "Or did you ensure it was lost in the confusion, after you'd added the crucial final entry? The entry that transformed Lewis's private despair into a public confession?" Gina didn't answer. Her silence was damning. "The mirror," Davies said, his voice hardening. "The one with the viewing ports. Explain its presence in Lewis's workshop. Explain the drilled holes." Gina's defiance faltered. She looked trapped. It was Maverick's," she stammered, "the smooth lie replaced by a clumsy evasion. He must have put it there, to spy on Lewis. He was obsessed with his subjects." "Spying with viewing ports drilled after the mirror was placed?" Ms. Marple countered gently. "Ports that align perfectly with the gallery level? Ports that show fresh tool marks? No, Ms. Van Rydock. That mirror wasn't Maverick's instrument of observation. It was yours. Your instrument of deception. You placed it there beforehand. You used it to see the exact spot on the gallery beam, the weak point Lewis himself had noted in his original journal entries. You used a long tool, perhaps a metal rod, perhaps even Lewis's own chisel inserted through the port, to apply precise, targeted pressure at that weak point. You triggered the collapse from the safety of the workshop, hidden by the mirror's reflection. You created the illusion of Lewis's guilt by manipulating the timeline, making it seem his actions caused the collapse, when in reality, your action, using his resentment and his tool as camouflage, caused it. You made time itself your accomplice."
The room seemed to hold its breath. Gina stared at Miss Marple, her face a mask of hatred and disbelief. The intricate clockwork of her deception, so meticulously wound, had been exposed, its gears grinding to a halt under the harsh light of truth. "You have no proof," Gina spat, but the words lacked conviction. "No one saw me. No one can prove I touched anything." "Perhaps not directly," Davies said, stepping forward,
but we have Lewis's testimony placing you inside the workshop at a critical time. We have the mirror with its strategically placed ports. We have the inconsistencies in the journal's timeline and content, which forensic examination will undoubtedly confirm. We have your prior knowledge of the structural weakness and your stated desire for a dramatic change at Stonygates. We have your convenient discovery of the journal. And, he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, we have this. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a heavy-duty steel chisel. Not the one found at the scene, but another one, identical in make and model. But this one had a distinctive scratch along its handle near the ferrule, and etched into the handle, clear and unmistakable, were the initials G.V.R. Gina's face went deathly white. Her eyes widened in utter shock. Where did you get that?" "From your luggage, Miss Van Rydock," Davies said grimly. "The bag you packed hastily last night, intending to leave before dawn. Sergeant Harris found it during a routine security sweep. A rather careless thing to pack, wouldn't you say, especially when you went to such lengths to plant Lewis's chisel at the scene. This has fresh wood splinters embedded in the tip and traces of plaster dust identical to samples taken from the collapsed debris. It seems you kept a souvenir, or perhaps a backup plan." The final piece clicked into place with devastating finality. Gina hadn't just used Lewis's chisel, she'd brought her own identical tool. A tool marked with her initials, a tool she then hid in her luggage, a fatal mistake born of arrogance and haste. The timeline of her deception was irrevocably broken, the illusion shattered. Gina stared at the chisel in the bag, then at Lewis, then at Miss Marple, and finally at the implacable face of Inspector Davies. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. The brilliant architect of ruin was reduced to rubble by the weight of her own meticulously crafted timeline, now turned against her. "It was for the trust," Gina whispered, her voice devoid of its former strength, thin and reedy. "It was falling apart. Years of mismanagement, Carrie Louise's sentiment. Maverick was a black hole, sucking resources, attracting controversy. His therapies, they were unethical, dangerous. I found proof, files he kept, experiment logs. If they'd surfaced, it would have destroyed the trust, destroyed everything. He had to be stopped, removed. The collapse? It was the perfect solution. Tragic accident? Blame falls on the violent delinquent. Stonygates closes. The trust is restructured, saved." She looked at Lewis, a flicker of something like pity in her eyes, quickly extinguished. "By trying to kill him?" Davies asked coldly. "By removing the obstacle," Gina corrected, a ghost of her old defiance returning. "Maverick's survival? Unfortunate. But the plan still worked. Lewis is exposed. Stonygates is finished. The trustees will see reason now." She straightened her shoulders, a final, futile act of pride. "Do your worst, Inspector. You have nothing that proves I intended to kill Maverick, only that I manipulated events, exploited an opportunity for the greater good." "The greater good doesn't include attempted murder, Miss Van Rydock," Davies stated flatly, "or framing an innocent man. Sergeant, arrest her." He turned to Lewis. "Lewis, you'll need to come down to the station to give a formal statement, but you're not under arrest." Lewis nodded numbly, relief warring with the shock of betrayal. As the sergeant moved forward to handcuff Gina, she looked directly at Miss Marple. There was no hatred left in her eyes, only a chilling, profound emptiness. "You see too much, old woman," Gina said, her voice flat. "Like that mirror, reflecting things better left hidden." She allowed the sergeant to lead her away, her head held high, the picture of ruined elegance. The room felt suddenly cavernous, filled only with the echoes of Gina's departure and the heavy silence of aftermath. Davies let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "Complicated business," he muttered. "She almost got away with it.
The timeline, it was clever, very clever. Because she understood that perception is shaped by sequence, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly. We believe what happened before caused what happened after. She controlled the before and the after that everyone saw. She made Lewis's past actions, his anger, his knowledge, seem like the direct cause of the collapse, while hiding her own present action, the push, in the blind spot between perception and reality. Time itself became her weapon. Lewis, who had been standing silently, spoke up, his voice rough but clear. She used my time, my past, my words, twisted them, made them mean something else. She tried to carve me into a monster, but the wood remembers what it was. Underneath, she tried to carve me into a monster, but the wood, it remembers. Miss Marple nodded, touched by the young man's insight. Indeed, Lewis, the truth, like the grain in the wood, has a way of resurfacing. It cannot be erased, only temporarily obscured. She turned to Davies. Inspector, I believe the young man has been through enough for one day. Perhaps his statement can wait until morning. Davies nodded. Of course, Miss Marple. Lewis, go on. Get cleaned up, get some rest. We'll sort this out. He watched Lewis leave, then turned back to Miss Marple. She played a long game, didn't she, Gina? Years, probably, waiting for the right moment, the right scapegoat. Patience and perception are the hallmarks of the true deceiver, Inspector, Miss Marple murmured. Gina Van Rydock possessed both in abundance. She saw not just the people, but the potential narratives woven through their lives, through the very stones of this house. She manipulated time, making past resentments present causes, and present actions past history. It was a master class in temporal deception. A master class that failed, Davies reminded her, a grim satisfaction in his voice. Thanks to you, and Lewis, and that mirror. He glanced towards the west wing. Forensics will go over that workshop with a fine-tooth comb now. They'll find tool marks on the mirror frame, traces matching the chisel in her bag. The journal will be analyzed. The timeline will be reconstructed properly. He sighed again. It's a mess, Miss Marple, a terrible mess for Stonygates, for Carrie Louise. Truth often leaves a mess in its wake, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. But it is a necessary mess. Illusion, however carefully constructed, however comforting, is ultimately a prison. Gina built her prison out of manipulated time and reflected lies. She trapped Lewis within it. She nearly trapped us all. Breaking free is painful, but essential. She looked towards the door, her expression thoughtful. Now, if you'll excuse me, Inspector, I believe I should check on Carrie Louise. The collapse of one illusion is often followed by the shattering of another. She left Davies to his reports and walked slowly through the quiet corridors of Stonygates. The house felt different, lighter perhaps, but also raw, exposed. The grand deception was over, but its echoes lingered in the dusty air, in the shadows that seemed less menacing now, more like scars. The master class in deception had concluded. Its final lesson delivered that time may be an illusion, but truth, once released from its manipulated confines, is an unstoppable force. And the clock, finally set right, began to tick towards a difficult but honest dawn.
Chapter 8. False Trails, the Art of the Red Herring. The arrest of Gina Van Rydock did not bring peace to Stonygates. Instead, it cast the sprawling estate into a state of suspended animation, like a clockwork mechanism with its mainspring violently snapped. The oppressive silence that followed the removal of the architect of ruin was heavier, more unsettling than the previous tension. It was the silence of a place forced to confront its own reflection, warts and all. Miss Marple observed this uneasy stillness from the window of the rose room, watching autumn leaves swirl like confused thoughts across the neglected lawns. The illusion of purpose, however fragile,
had been shattered. Now only the harsh light of consequence remained. Carrie Louise Van Rydock had retreated entirely. Confined to her rooms under Dr. Evans's strict orders, she was a ghost haunting her own existence. Ruth moved like a shadow between her sister's bedroom and the door, her face etched with a new kind of fear. Not the fear of external violence, but the dread of internal collapse. "She won't speak, Jane," Ruth had whispered to Miss Marple earlier that morning, her voice thin as parchment. "She just stares at the wall, at her hands. It's like the light went out inside her. Gina's betrayal, Lewis's ordeal, it broke something fundamental." Edgar Lawson, stripped of his obsessive focus on Lewis, seemed adrift. He wandered the corridors like a restless phantom, his usual sharpness dulled by a profound disillusionment. He'd spent hours with Inspector Davies, recounting his observations, his suspicions, his own culpability in fostering the toxic atmosphere. "I saw only the darkness I wanted to see," he'd confessed to Miss Marple in the library, his voice hollow. "I became the monster I accused Lewis of being. My perception, it was a funhouse mirror." He now spent his time in the West Wing workshop, not with Lewis, but alone, attempting to salvage wood from the less damaged areas, his movements slow, lacking their former aggressive energy. Lewis himself was a study in quiet resilience. Cleared of suspicion, but bearing the scars of accusation, he had retreated to his sanctuary. Miss Marple found him there the day after Gina's arrest, not carving the swan, but meticulously cleaning and organizing his tools. The half-finished bird stood on the bench, a poignant symbol of interrupted grace. "Lewis," Miss Marple said softly, stepping into the familiar scent of wood and oil. He looked up, his pale eyes holding a wariness that hadn't been there before, but also a flicker of something else. Relief? Exhaustion? "Miss Marple." "You're safe now, Lewis," she said gently. "Gina cannot harm you further." He nodded, running a cloth along the blade of a chisel with methodical care. "Safe, yes, but not free." He gestured vaguely around the workshop, then towards the main house. "This place, the looks, the whispers, they still see what she made them see. The monster." "Perception lingers, Lewis," Miss Marple acknowledged, "like an echo. But it fades, especially when countered by consistent truth." She gestured towards the swan. "That is truth. Your skill, your focus, your peace when you work here, that is the Lewis Carrie Louise believed in. The Lewis who exists, beneath the shadows Gina cast." He looked at the swan, his expression softening slightly. "Carrie Louise." He sighed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "She is broken? Shattered, perhaps, but not beyond repair. Like wood, Lewis, even the most damaged grain can be sanded, polished, made beautiful again. It takes time, care." She paused, studying his face. "You cared for her. Truly. That wasn't deception." "No, not deception, just not enough. To stop Gina. To stop all of it." He looked at Miss Marple, his gaze direct, searching. "Why? Why did she do it? The money? The power?" "Both," Miss Marple said, "and something more. Control." Gina perceived Stonygates, Carrie Louise's vision, as flawed sentimentality. Maverick is dangerous incompetence. You as a useful tool. She believed her actions were pragmatic, necessary, a harsh correction to a failing system. She deceived herself as thoroughly as she deceived others. Lewis absorbed this, turning the chisel over in his hands. "And the mirror? The one she used?" Ah, Miss Marple said, a spark of her old curiosity returning. That is a question that lingers. Why hide it here, in your workshop? It was reckless, uncharacteristically so for someone as meticulous as Gina. She looked around the workshop, her eyes lingering on the covered mirrors still tucked under the workbench. Unless it wasn't just a tool for the collapse, unless it served another purpose, or pointed to something else. Something else? Like what? Like another secret, Miss Marple murmured. Another layer to Stonygates' deceptive architecture. Gina was clever, Lewis. She wouldn't leave a loose end like that mirror unless it served a purpose beyond the immediate crime, unless it was meant to be found, eventually, to misdirect, to create a new trail. The thought took root, unsettling in its implications. A red herring planted as the main deception unfolded.
The unsettling quiet was broken 2 days later by the arrival of the Stonygates Trust Board. Led by the formidable Sir Hector Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of profound disapproval, they descended upon the estate like a flock of carrion birds. Their purpose was clear: assessment, disposal. The future of Stonygates hung by a thread thinner than Carrie Louise's fragile nerves. Sir Hector convened an emergency meeting in the blue drawing room, the same room where Carrie Louise's misplaced faith had first been so starkly contrasted with Edgar's rage. Now it felt like a courtroom. Sir Hector sat at the head of the long table, flanked by 2 other trustees, a nervous-looking banker named Mr. Pettigrew, and a sharp-eyed woman, Ms. Armitage, known for her ruthless efficiency in corporate turnarounds. Ruth sat rigidly beside Carrie Louise's empty chair. Carrie Louise had been deemed too unwell to attend. Edgar stood awkwardly near the window. Miss Marple had been invited as a courtesy, or perhaps as a witness to the decline. "The situation is untenable," Sir Hector began, his voice like gravel crunching underfoot. "Catastrophic financial mismanagement, a near-fatal accident resulting from criminal negligence, the arrest of a trustee for attempted murder and conspiracy. The institution's reputation is in tatters." He fixed Ruth with a stern glare. "Mrs. Van Rydock, as executor of Mrs. Van Rydock's affairs and acting head in her absence, what is your recommendation?" Ruth swallowed hard. "Sir Hector, the Trust's primary purpose, as set out by the founder, was Carrie Louise's vision of rehabilitation through compassionate care. To abandon that now—" "Compassionate care," Sir Hector snorted. "Madam, that compassionate care nearly got a man killed and landed another in prison. It's bankrupted us. The board has a fiduciary duty, not a sentimental one." He turned to Miss Armitage. "Miss Armitage, your preliminary findings." Miss Armitage shuffled papers, her movements crisp. "The estate itself is a liability, Sir Hector. The West Wing is a total loss. The main house requires millions in essential repairs just to be habitable, let alone functional. The rehabilitation wing is outdated and undersized for modern standards. The operational costs, even stripped to the bone, exceed potential income by a significant margin." She paused. "However," she added, her sharp eyes glinting, "there is one potentially valuable asset." All eyes turned to her. "The land," Miss Armitage stated. "Stonygate sits on over 200 acres, prime development land given its proximity to the expanding town. The house itself, while a ruin, has historical significance. It could be sold to a developer. The proceeds would clear the Trust's debts and provide a substantial endowment for alternative charitable purposes, more modern, more manageable facilities." "Alternative purposes?" Ruth echoed, aghast. "You mean sell Stonygates? Break it up? Abandon the boys?"
"The boys will be relocated, Mrs. Van Rydock," Sir Hector said impatiently, "to appropriate, regulated facilities. This experiment is over. It failed spectacularly." "Failed?" Edgar spoke up, his voice gaining strength. "Because it was sabotaged. Gina Van Rydock didn't just attack Maverick, she attacked the very idea of Stonygates. She manipulated events to make it look dangerous, unsustainable. If she hadn't, Miss Armitage interrupted smoothly, Mr. Lawson, the financial pressures would have forced closure within 18 months anyway. Gina's actions merely accelerated the inevitable. They provided a convenient, dramatic excuse. She looked around the table. The question isn't if we sell, but how we maximize the return. The house, the land, they are the only assets left. Miss Marple listened, her mind processing not just the words, but the subtext. Miss Armitage's focus on the land felt pointed, almost eager, and her dismissal of Gina's sabotage as merely accelerating the inevitable felt like a deliberate minimization, a red herring designed to steer the narrative away from the possibility that Stonygates could be saved, that the vision wasn't inherently flawed, just criminally undermined. "There might be another consideration," Miss Marple said quietly, drawing all eyes to her. "Regarding the assets." Sir Hector raised an eyebrow. "Miss Marple, you have some insight." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "During my exploration of the West Wing prior to the collapse, I came across something unusual, a hidden door." She described finding the concealed entrance near the empty mirror frame in the ruined salon. It led to a short, unused corridor. At the end, another door. I didn't have time to investigate further before the collapse made the area unsafe. A flicker of something, interest, concern, passed over Miss Armitage's face, quickly masked. Sir Hector looked intrigued. A hidden door? To what? Cellars? Storage? "Unknown," Miss Marple admitted, "but it was substantial, well concealed. It suggests the possibility of undiscovered spaces, perhaps rooms, perhaps even valuables, artwork, documents, items of historical significance that could hold significant value, both monetary and historical." She watched Miss Armitage closely as she spoke. The woman's knuckles whitened slightly on her pen. "Undiscovered spaces?" Mr. Pettigrew perked up, the banker. "That could change the valuation significantly." "Nonsense," Miss Armitage said, a little too quickly. "Old houses like this are full of forgotten cupboards and damp cellars. They rarely yield anything of real value, certainly not enough to alter the fundamental financial picture. The land is the only sure asset." "But it could," Mr. Pettigrew insisted. "We can't just ignore it. We need to investigate before any decisions are made." Sir Hector stroked his chin. "He has a point, Miss Armitage. Prudence dictates we explore all potential assets, especially given the unique history of this place." He looked at Miss Marple. "Can you indicate the location, Miss Marple?" "Of course, Sir Hector, though I must stress the area near the collapse is extremely dangerous. We'll send in a structural engineer first thing tomorrow. If it's deemed safe, we'll investigate this hidden door. In the meantime," he looked back at Ruth and Edgar, "the board will deliberate, but be under no illusion, Mrs. Van Rydock, Mr. Lawson. The status quo is untenable. Change is coming. Drastic change." The meeting adjourned, leaving a trail of anxiety in its wake. Ruth looked near tears. Edgar seemed both frustrated and strangely hopeful. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Miss Armitage as the trustees filed out. The woman's reaction to the mention of the hidden door had not been mere skepticism. It had been defensive, almost fearful. Why? Unless she knew what might be behind it, or feared what its discovery might reveal.
The next morning, under a grey, drizzling sky that mirrored the mood, a team led by a pragmatic structural engineer and accompanied by Sir Hector, Miss Armitage, Mr. Pettigrew, Miss Marple, and the reluctant Edgar, entered the sealed west wing. The air was still thick with the smell of damp dust and decay. The engineer, a man named Briggs, moved with professional caution, examining the remaining structure around the ballroom entrance. "The main collapse zone is still highly unstable," Briggs announced, shining his torch into the cavernous ruin. "But the corridor Miss Marple described, it's off the salon, yes? That area seems relatively intact. The load-bearing walls there appear sound. We can proceed carefully." They picked their way through the debris-strewn salon to the spot Miss Marple indicated. The empty mirror frame hung crookedly on the wall. Briggs examined the area closely, tapping the plaster. "Here," he said, pointing to the faint line Miss Marple had noticed days before. "A concealed hinge mechanism. Clever." He found a small recessed catch and pressed it. With a soft click, a section of the panelling swung inward, revealing the narrow, dark passage Miss Marple had glimpsed. Torch beams cut through the gloom as they entered. The air was stale, cold. The passage was short, perhaps 15 feet long, ending at another sturdy wooden door, similar to the one Miss Marple had seen leading to the cellar with the grand mirror. This one, however, was locked. A large, old-fashioned keyhole stared back at them. "Locked," Mr. Pettigrew said, disappointed. "Now what?" Briggs examined the lock. "Old, probably unique key. We could force it, but risk damaging the door, or whatever's behind it." "Perhaps not necessary," Miss Marple said softly. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, leather-bound case. Inside were an assortment of old keys she'd collected during her stay. One found in the Rose-Room desk, another in the library, a third near the conservatory. She'd kept them on a whim, a detective's habit. One never knows. She tried the largest, most ornate key first. It didn't fit. The second was too small. The third, a simple, heavy brass key, slid smoothly into the lock. With a satisfying clunk, the lock turned. Miss Armitage took a sharp, almost inaudible intake of breath. Sir Hector looked impressed. Mr. Pettigrew beamed. Edgar watched, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple pushed the door open. Beyond was not a cellar, not a storage room. It was a small, perfectly square chamber, surprisingly intact. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with leather-bound volumes. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mahogany desk. A single high window set into the outer wall was covered in grime, but allowed a weak, filtered light to penetrate the gloom. It was a study, a hidden study. "Oh my," Mr. Pettigrew breathed, stepping inside. "Look at these books. First editions, histories, philosophies. This is incredible." Sir Hector moved towards the desk. Letters, documents, anything that might shed light on the estate's history or finances. Miss Armitage hung back near the doorway, her torch beam sweeping the shelves, her expression unreadable but tense. Miss Marple noticed her eyes kept darting towards a particular section of the bookshelf on the far wall, near the desk. Edgar moved towards the desk, picking up a leather-bound ledger lying open on its surface. "It's a diary," he said, flipping through pages filled with dense, elegant handwriting. "Dated 1898, belonging to Alistair Van Rydock, the founder's brother." He read a passage aloud. "The west wing grows unstable. The architect's vision exceeded the materials. I fear for the gallery beam. I've commissioned a secret study here, a refuge should the worst occur. A place to think, away from the noise and sentimentality that plagues my brother's household. True progress requires clarity, not compassion." Edgar looked up, meeting Miss Marple's gaze. Clarity, not compassion. Sounds familiar.
Alistair Van Rydock, Sir Hector mused, the black sheep of the family I recall, pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness, disapproved strongly of his brother's philanthropic leanings. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes scanning the room. It felt like a sanctuary for a cold, calculating mind, a place where the founder's more compassionate vision could be dissected and dismissed. And Gina had admired this kind of ruthless pragmatism. Had she known about this room? Had it inspired her? Mr. Pettigrew was excitedly examining the bookshelves. The value of these books alone, the historical significance of this room, it changes everything. We can't sell this just as land. This is a heritage site. Perhaps, Miss Armitage said, her voice tight. She stepped further into the room, her gaze still fixed on the section of bookshelf near the desk. She reached out, almost absently, and pulled on a particular book, a thick volume on structural engineering. There was a soft click. The entire section of bookshelf swung inward, revealing yet another hidden space. Not a room this time, but a shallow, walled safe set into the stone. Everyone froze. "My word," Mr. Pettigrew gasped. Sir Hector stepped forward. "Briggs, can you open it?" Briggs examined the safe. Old combination lock, tricky, could take hours, days. "Perhaps not necessary," Miss Marple said again, her eyes fixed on the safe door. She noticed faint scratches around the dial, worn smooth in places. She reached out and carefully turned the dial, feeling for the subtle catches, the worn spots that indicated frequent use. Left to 15, right to 30, left to 10, right to 5. A sequence that felt familiar, like the combination to an old safe in her own village post office decades ago. With a satisfying thunk, the safe door opened. Inside was not gold or jewels. It was a single flat leather portfolio tied with a faded ribbon. Miss Armitage made a small, involuntary sound. It might have been a gasp. It might have been a stifled curse. Sir Hector carefully lifted the portfolio out and untied the ribbon. He opened it on the desk. Inside were architectural drawings, detailed, meticulous plans of Stonygates, but not as it was, as it could have been. Grand expansions, modernized facilities, a vastly enlarged rehabilitation wing, landscaped gardens, and overlaid on the plans in red ink were annotations, calculations, cost projections, and a signature at the bottom, Gina Van Rydock. But it wasn't just Gina's signature. Scrawled beside it, in a different hand, was another name, Miss E. Armitage, and below that, a date. 6 months ago. The silence in the hidden study was absolute, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof high above. Sir Hector stared at the plans, his face slowly turning purple with rage. Mr. Pettigrew looked utterly bewildered. Edgar's eyes widened in dawning horror. Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on Miss Armitage. The trustee stood rigidly, her usual sharp composure shattered. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and calculation. The red herring, the hidden door, the study, the safe hadn't led to treasure or historical insight. It had led straight to her, to proof of a conspiracy far deeper, far more audacious than Gina's solo act of sabotage. The masterclass in deception had a new, far more dangerous lesson to teach.
Chapter 9. The Grand Reveal. Christie's masterful unmasking. The dust motes, dancing in the weak light filtering through the grimy window of the hidden study, seemed to freeze, suspended in the thick silence that followed Sir Hector's discovery. The architectural plans lay spread across the mahogany desk like a confession written in ink and betrayal. Miss Armitage stood trapped, not just by the walls of the secret room, but by the undeniable evidence of her collusion. Sir Hector's face was a thunderhead of suppressed fury. Mr. Pettigrew looked as though he might faint. Edgar Lawson stared at the signature beside Gina's, his expression shifting from shock to a dawning, terrible understanding. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind already connecting the final, damning threads. "Explain," Sir Hector repeated, his voice dangerously soft, yet it carried the weight of an avalanche. "These plans, your signature, with Gina Van Rydock, 6 months ago, while you sat on this very trust, tasked with preserving Carrie Louise's vision. What is this, Miss Armitage?" Miss Armitage drew herself up, a desperate attempt to reclaim her usual composure. Her voice, when it came, was brittle, stripped of its former efficiency. It was a contingency plan, Sir Hector, nothing more, a feasibility study. Gina approached me. She shared concerns, valid concerns, I might add, about the financial viability of Stonygates in its current form. We explored alternatives. Alternatives? Edgar exploded, stepping forward, his face flushed with anger. He jabbed a finger at the plans showing the main house reduced to a facade, the grounds carved into luxury housing estates, the rehabilitation wing replaced by a sterile, minimal facility tucked into a corner. This is demolition. This is the complete destruction of everything Carrie Louise built, everything we've worked for. Sentiment is not a sustainable business model, Mr. Lawson, Miss Armitage retorted, her voice gaining a sliver of her old sharpness, though it trembled slightly. Carrie Louise's vision, while noble, was financially irresponsible. Gina recognized that. I recognized that. These plans represented a way to salvage something from the wreckage, to maximize the asset value of the land, ensure the trust's survival, and provide some form of continued, albeit more focused, charitable endeavor. It was pragmatic. Pragmatic? Miss Marple's quiet voice cut through the rising tension like a scalpel. All eyes turned to her. She moved closer to the desk, her gaze fixed on Miss Armitage. Pragmatics does not typically involve secret meetings, hidden plans, and collusion with a trustee who was simultaneously plotting sabotage and murder, Miss Armitage. Pragmatics does not require deception on this scale. This was not contingency planning. This was a blueprint for a hostile takeover, using Gina Van Rydock as your instrument. Miss Armitage flinched. You have no proof. On the contrary, Miss Marple interrupted smoothly. The proof is here, in this room, in the timing, in the sequence of events you so carefully manipulated. She began to pace slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving Miss Armitage's face. Let us reconstruct the timeline, shall we? Not the false one Gina constructed to frame Lewis, but the true one, the one that leads directly to you. She paused, letting the anticipation build. 6 months ago, you and Gina Van Rydock began formulating these plans. You saw the financial pressures mounting. You saw Carrie Louise's unwavering commitment to her vision as an obstacle. You saw Dr. Maverick's controversial, expensive program as a liability and a potential scandal waiting to erupt. You needed a catalyst, something dramatic, something that would make the closure of Stonygates and the implementation of your plans not just acceptable, but necessary. Miss Marple picked up the portfolio. Gina provided the catalyst. Her obsession with control, her ruthless pragmatism. She saw Lewis not just as a potential scapegoat for Maverick's removal, but as the perfect tool to discredit the entire rehabilitation program. A violent delinquent nurtured by Carrie Louise's misguided compassion, turning on the very system meant to save him.
It was a narrative tailor-made to justify shutting Stonygates down. She looked at Sir Hector. But Gina's plan, while clever, was risky. It relied on chance, on Lewis behaving predictably, on Maverick being in the right place at the right time, on the collapse being fatal enough to remove Maverick, but not so catastrophic it destroyed the entire property value. You, Miss Armitage, provided the insurance, the backup plan. Miss Marple's gaze bored into Miss Armitage. You knew about Gina's intentions towards Maverick, perhaps not the exact method, but certainly the goal. You knew she intended to use Lewis. You knew she was manipulating events, and you allowed it, encouraged it even. Because if Gina succeeded in killing Maverick and framing Lewis, the scandal would be immense. Stonygates would be branded a dangerous failure. Public opinion would demand its closure. Your development plans could then be presented as the only viable solution, the salvage operation. She leaned forward slightly. But if Gina failed, if Maverick survived, if Lewis wasn't convincingly framed, you still had these plans, hidden away, discovered later, presented as the only pragmatic response to the unavoidable financial and reputational damage caused by the accident and Gina's subsequent arrest. Either way, Miss Armitage, Stonygates fell. Carrie Louise's vision ended, and your development plans, signed by you and Gina, became the future. Heads you win, tails Carrie Louise loses. The silence in the study was profound. The weight of Miss Marple's logic settled over the room like a shroud. Mr. Pettigrew looked utterly appalled. Sir Hector's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the desk. Edgar stared at Miss Armitage with undisguised contempt. That's monstrous," Mr. Pettigrew whispered. "Using tragedy, attempted murder, as a business strategy?" "It's not monstrous, it's realistic," Miss Armitage snapped, her composure finally fracturing completely. Her voice rose shrill with desperation. "Don't you see? Carrie Louise was drowning this place in sentiment, throwing good money after bad, coddling criminals. Gina saw it, I saw it. This trust was dying. We were offering a lifeline, a way to preserve some good, to fund real help elsewhere, instead of pouring it down this drain of misplaced idealism. Gina's methods, they were extreme, yes, but necessary, to break the deadlock, to force change." "Force change?" Edgar's voice was low, vibrating with suppressed fury. "You mean force destruction. You mean force the destruction of hope for boys like Lewis, for boys like Stephen, whose only chance was here. You call that real help? Selling their sanctuary to build luxury flats?"
"Hope," Miss Armitage scoffed, though her voice trembled. "Hope doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Lawson. Hope doesn't repair crumbling roofs or fund effective therapy. Hope is a luxury Stonygates could no longer afford. Gina understood that. I understood that. We were prepared to make the hard choices Carrie Louise couldn't." "The hard choice," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through Miss Armitage's tirade, "should never have been deceit, should never have been manipulation, should never have been collusion in the attempted murder and the framing of an innocent boy. That is not pragmatism, Miss Armitage. That is corruption. That is evil." She gestured towards the plans. "And you were not just an observer. You were an architect. You provided the blueprint for Gina's actions and the blueprint for Stonygates' destruction. You used her ruthlessness as your weapon and her potential failure as your fallback. You are as guilty as she is, perhaps more so, for your betrayal was colder, more calculated." Miss Armitage looked around the room, at the accusing faces, at the damning evidence on the desk. the fight drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, terrified emptiness. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, perhaps to plead, but no sound came out. The hidden study, designed by Alistair Van Rydock as a refuge from sentimentality, had become her tomb. The red herring she'd likely hoped would be dismissed as historical curiosity had become the hook that exposed her entire conspiracy. Sir Hector found his voice, thick with disgust. "Miss Armitage, you are suspended from the trust, effective immediately. Your resignation will be on my desk by morning. These plans," he gestured at the portfolio with disgust, "will be turned over to the police, along with my full statement regarding your collusion." He looked at Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, your insight has been invaluable and deeply disturbing." "The truth often is, Sir Hector," Miss Marple murmured. As if summoned by the tension, the door to the hidden study creaked open further. Standing in the dim light of the passage beyond was Carrie Louise Van Rydock. She was pale, fragile, leaning heavily on Ruth's arm, but her eyes, wide and haunted, were fixed on Miss Armitage. She had heard. She had come. Miss Armitage flinched as if struck. "Carrie Louise, I can explain." Carrie Louise slowly shook her head, a gesture of infinite sadness. Her voice, when it came, was weak but clear, cutting through the thick air. "Explain? How? How do you explain this?" She gestured vaguely toward the plans on the desk, her gaze sweeping over Miss Armitage, Sir Hector, the room itself. "Using Gina, using Lewis, using Alistair's suffering as a tool to destroy everything?" Tears welled in her pale eyes, but did not fall. They seemed to freeze there like ice. "I trusted you, Eleanor. I thought you understood. I thought you cared." "I do care, Carrie Louise," Miss Armitage cried out, a desperate final plea. "I care about the future, about ensuring the trust survives, about ensuring the work continues in a form that actually works. Your way, it was beautiful, but it was failing. Can't you see that? It was killing us, killing the trust." Carrie Louise looked at her for a long, silent moment. The sadness in her eyes deepened, hardened into something colder, more profound than anger. It was the look of someone whose faith had been not just broken, but annihilated, replaced by the terrible clarity of absolute betrayal. "No, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet it carried absolute finality. "You cared about the money, about the control, about the efficiency. You cared about the plans. This place, this room, it's yours. It's always been yours. A place without heart." She turned away, leaning more heavily on Ruth. "Take me away, Ruth, please. I have seen enough." Ruth guided Carrie Louise back down the hidden passage, her own face streaked with tears. Carrie Louise didn't look back. The silence she left behind was heavier, more devastating than any accusation. Miss Armitage stared after her, her face crumpling. The last vestige of her defense, her claim to pragmatism, to caring for the greater good, had evaporated in the face of Carrie Louise's shattered gaze. She stood alone in the room, filled with the ghosts of ruthless ambition, exposed and utterly defeated. Sir Hector broke the silence. "Sergeant," he called out towards the passage. 2 uniformed officers appeared. "Take Miss Armitage into custody.
Hold her for questioning regarding conspiracy to defraud the trust and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. He looked at the portfolio. And take this. It's evidence. As the officers moved forward, Miss Armitage offered no resistance. She allowed them to lead her away, her head bowed, the picture of ruined ambition. The hidden study, once a symbol of secret power, had become her cell.
Look around you, Miss Marple urged. The house is damaged. Yes, the west wing is gone. But the heart of Stonygates is still here, in this room, in the workshop where Lewis finds peace, in the potential that still exists in boys like Stephen, like Tommy, in people like Ruth, like Edgar, who, despite their flaws, care deeply. And in you, Carrie Louise, your vision was not destroyed, it was attacked brutally, but it endures, because it is rooted in truth, in human connection, not in the cold calculations of balance sheets and development plans. Carrie Louise was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, giving her space. Finally, Carrie Louise took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked up, and though the sadness was still there, a tiny spark of the old determination flickered in her pale eyes. What would rebuilding look like, Jane?" she asked, her voice stronger than before. "Realistically, without the trust being bled dry, without illusions?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It would look smaller, perhaps, more focused. It would require hard choices, pragmatism even, but pragmatism guided by compassion, not replacing it. It would mean leveraging the historical value Mr. Pettigrew is so excited about, the hidden study, the main house's architecture, to attract grants, donations. It would mean partnering with modern mental health services, not replacing them, to ensure the boys get the best possible care. It would mean Edgar focusing on practical skills training that leads to real employment,
It would mean Ruth managing the finances with ruthless efficiency, but always guided by the mission. She paused. And it would mean accepting help from people who believe. People like Sir Hector, who, though shaken, recognizes the historical importance. People like Mr. Pettigrew, who sees the value now. People like Lewis. "Lewis," Carrie Louise whispered, after everything, after being accused, after nearly being destroyed." "Lewis is still here, Carrie Louise," Miss Marple said softly. "He is carving his swan. He is cleaning his tools. He is waiting to see if the sanctuary you offered is still real, if the belief you had in him was real. Show him it is. Show them all." Carrie Louise looked towards the window, towards the direction of the West Wing workshop. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of despair. It was a tear of release, of painful, hard-won hope. "It will be hard, Jane," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "So hard. To trust again, to hope again." "The hardest things often are, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, "but they are also the most worthwhile. The art of illusion is practiced by many, but the art of rebuilding, that requires something far rarer, far stronger. It requires the courage to see the truth, however painful, and the faith to build upon it, stone by stone." Carrie Louise nodded slowly. She picked up her cup of tea, her hand steady now. She took a small sip. "Stone by stone," she echoed, a faint, fragile smile touching her lips. "Yes, stone by stone." Outside, the autumn rain had finally stopped. Weak sunlight struggled through the breaking clouds, catching the wet leaves, making them gleam like scattered jewels. In the distance, the rhythmic, familiar thump, thump, thump of Lewis's mallet could be heard, echoing from the old workshop. It was the sound of creation, of control, of a craftsman shaping his world. It was the sound of Stonygates, battered, betrayed, but not broken. It was the sound of a new beginning, painstakingly carved from the wreckage of deception. The masterclass in illusion was over. The lesson in rebuilding had just begun.
Chapter 10. The Legacy of Deception. Why the Novel Endures. The first frost of winter silvered the neglected lawns of Stonygates, transforming the sprawling estate into a study in fragile beauty. Crisp air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the cloying tension that had choked the manor for weeks. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted too. The oppressive silence of betrayal had been replaced by the quiet, determined sounds of rebuilding. Miss Marple observed it all from the window of the rose room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a steady counterpoint to the hammering coming from the West Wing workshop. Lewis was there, not hiding, not skulking, but working. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of his mallet was no longer a sound of concealed fury or desperate creation, but of measured, purposeful labor. He was no longer carving his swan in isolation. He was teaching Stephen, the boy whose nightmares had been fueled by Dr. Maverick's treatments, how to shape wood. Stephen, still pale, but with a flicker of newfound confidence in his eyes, watched Lewis's hands, mimicking the careful movements as they planed a smooth surface on a length of oak. "See the grain?" Lewis's voice, once rough and rarely used, now carried a quiet authority. "It tells you how the wood wants to be cut. Go with it, not against it. Like finding the path of least resistance." He guided Stephen's hands, adjusting the angle of the plane. Gentle, but firm. Control. Stephen nodded, his focus intense. Like not fighting the fear, just letting it flow past. Lewis met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Yeah, something like that,"
He stepped back, letting Stephen try alone. The boy's movements were hesitant at first, then grew smoother, more confident. A small, genuine smile touched Lewis's lips, a rare sight, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Miss Marple watched, a profound sense of satisfaction warming her heart. This was the real Stonygates, not the decaying monument to faded grandeur, not the stage for deception, but a place of tangible healing. Lewis, the accused murderer, was now a mentor. Stephen, the traumatized victim, was learning a skill, finding focus. The cycle of violence and manipulation was being broken, replaced by the quiet rhythm of craftsmanship and care. In the blue drawing room, the atmosphere was different but equally charged with purpose. Carrie Louise, though still frail, sat at the head of a large table. The fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm glow. Ruth, no longer hovering anxiously, but seated with an air of quiet competence, spread a series of ledgers and architectural drawings across the polished surface. Opposite her sat Sir Hector Thorne, his usual disapproval softened into cautious optimism. Beside him was Mr. Pettigrew, practically vibrating with excitement. Edgar Lawson stood by the window, looking out over the grounds, his posture less rigid, more grounded. "Phase 1 is secure," Ruth announced, her voice clear and steady. She'd tapped a detailed budget projection. The emergency grant from the Heritage Foundation, secured on the strength of the historical significance of the main house and the hidden study, covers the essential roof repairs and structural stabilization of the east wing and rehabilitation block. Mr. Lawson's revised vocational program, focusing on sustainable crafts and land management, has attracted significant private sponsorship. She slid a paper towards Sir Hector. "Here are the initial commitments." Sir Hector scanned the document, his eyebrows rising. "Impressive, Ruth. Very impressive. And the long-term plan?" Ruth indicated the architectural drawings. "We're not rebuilding the West Wing as it was. Instead," she pointed to a new section of the plan, "we're converting the most stable part of the old workshop and the adjacent intact storage areas into the Alistair Van Rydyck Heritage Centre. It will house the study, preserved as found, alongside exhibits on the estate's history, the evolution of rehabilitation philosophies, and," she paused, meeting Carrie Louise's gaze, a grateful smile touching her lips, "the ongoing story of Stonygates renewal. It will generate income through tourism and educational programs." "A museum?" Edgar asked, turning from the window. "To the man who hated sentimentality?" "A museum to the complexity of this place, Edgar, to the clash of ideals, to the dangers of unchecked pragmatism and blind sentimentality, to the mirrors we all hold up." She looked at Miss Marple, a faint, grateful smile touching her lips. "It will be a place of reflection, of learning from the past, not hiding from it." Mr. Pettigrew beamed. "And the land. We've negotiated a conservation easement with the county council. They'll purchase the development rights for the northern meadows, ensuring they remain green space forever. The proceeds, combined with the heritage grant and sponsorships, create a sustainable endowment fund. We can expand the program, take in more boys, offer better support services." He rubbed his hands together. "It's not just salvage, Carrie Louise, it's transformation." Carrie Louise looked around the table, at Ruth's quiet strength, Sir Hector's guarded approval, Edgar's thoughtful stillness, Mr. Pettigrew's infectious enthusiasm. The ice that had encased her heart since Gina's betrayal was finally thawing, replaced by a cautious, hard-won warmth. "It is," she agreed softly, "it is transformation, stone by stone, truth by truth." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found Lewis in the main workshop, not the hidden one. He was alone, putting the finishing touches on the swan. The carving was complete now, a thing of breathtaking grace, its neck curved in an elegant arc, its feathers rendered with astonishing delicacy. It no longer looked like an interrupted cry. It looked like a statement of survival, of beauty reclaimed from the rough block. "It's beautiful, Lewis," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. Lewis looked up, a quiet pride in his eyes. He ran a cloth lightly over the finished wood. "Took a long time," he murmured. Had to put it down after everything. Felt wrong, like carving a lie." He traced the swan's wing with a gentle finger. "But now it feels true, like finding the shape that was always there, under the anger, under the fear." "Like finding the grain," Miss Marple said softly, recalling his words to Stephen. Lewis nodded. "Yeah, like the grain." He looked at her directly, his gaze clear and steady. "Carrie Louise, she asked me to stay, to help, teach the boys, like I helped Stephen." He hesitated, then added, Is that all right, after what I almost became?" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Lewis, the question is not what you almost became. It is what you are choosing to become now. You are choosing to build, not destroy, to teach, not terrorize, to find the grain, not fight it. That is not just all right, that is remarkable." She looked at the swan. "This swan, it's more than wood now. It's a promise of renewal." Lewis looked at the carving, then at Miss Marple. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Yeah," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that had been absent before. "A promise."
The day of Miss Marple's departure dawned crisp and clear. The weak winter sun cast long, sharp shadows across the grounds. A light dusting of frost sparkled on the grass. Ruth drove her to the small country station in the sturdy Austin Cambridge, the same car that had brought her to Stonygates weeks ago, though the journey felt immeasurably longer. "Are you sure you won't stay longer, Jane?" Ruth asked, as they pulled up to the platform. "Just a few more days. Carrie Louise is so much stronger. The plans are really taking shape." Miss Marple smiled, patting Ruth's hand. "My dear, my work here is done. The deception has been uncovered. The truth, however painful, has been faced. The rebuilding has begun. That is the important work. That is for all of you now." She looked towards the distant silhouette of Stonygates. "Stonygates will endure, Ruth. Not as it was, perhaps, but as it needs to be. Stronger, wiser, built on truth, not illusion." Ruth nodded, her eyes misting. "Thank you, Jane, for everything, for seeing what we couldn't, for caring enough to look." Miss Marple's train sighed into the station, a plume of steam momentarily obscuring the platform. As Miss Marple gathered her handbag, a figure hurried towards them. It was Edgar Lawson. He looked different, less agitated, more centered. He carried a flat, wrapped parcel. "Miss Marple, I'm glad I caught you." "Edgar," Miss Marple greeted him, "you look well." Edgar gave a self-deprecating shrug. "Finding purpose helps. Ruth has me overseeing the vocational program expansion, working with Lewis, with the boys." He held out the parcel. "This is for you, a token of gratitude, from all of us, but especially from Lewis." Miss Marple took the parcel, surprised. "Edgar, you shouldn't have." "Please," Edgar insisted. "Open it." Miss Marple carefully unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a framed mirror. It wasn't grand or gilded. It was simple, elegant, made of pale, polished wood. The frame was intricately carved, not with ornate scrolls, but with delicate intertwining branches and leaves, echoing the natural world outside. The glass itself was flawless,
clear and bright. It's from the wood of the old west wing beam, the one that fell. Lewis salvaged it. He said it was strong wood, good wood. It just needed a new purpose. He carved the frame. Stephen helped with the finishing. We all thought—" He trailed off, slightly embarrassed. Miss Marple touched the smooth wood of the frame, feeling the warmth of it, the history embedded in its grain. She looked into the mirror. It reflected her own face, clear and true, but also reflected the station platform, the waiting train, Ruth's anxious face, Edgar's hopeful expression. It reflected the world as it was, flawed, complex, but undeniably real. "It's beautiful, Edgar," Miss Marple said, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly beautiful. Please thank Lewis and Stephen and everyone." She held the mirror carefully. "It is the perfect reminder." "Of what?" Edgar asked. Miss Marple looked from her reflection in the mirror to Edgar's earnest face, then towards the distant Stonygates. "That mirrors can indeed deceive," she said softly, "but they can also reveal. They can reflect the truth if we have the courage to look clearly, without flinching, without illusion." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "This mirror reflects the truth of Stonygates now, not the deception it was built on, but the strength it is rebuilding with. That is a legacy worth carrying." As the guard called "All aboard," Miss Marple hugged Ruth goodbye, shook Edgar's hand, and climbed aboard the train. She found a compartment by the window and placed the framed mirror carefully on the seat opposite her. As the train began to move, pulling away from the station, she looked out at the receding landscape, the frosty fields, the bare trees, the distant, sprawling shape of Stonygates growing smaller. She thought of the novel that had drawn her here. They do it with mirrors. She thought of Christie's genius, not just in plotting the intricate deception, but in understanding the human heart that drove it. The novel wasn't just a puzzle. It was a profound exploration of how easily we are deceived by appearances, by our own desires and fears, by the stories we tell ourselves. It was about the danger of unchecked pragmatism and the peril of blind sentimentality. It was about the corrosive power of secrets and the healing power of truth. But most of all, Miss Marple realized, watching Stonygates vanish into the winter haze, the novel endured because it offered hope. Hope that even after the most devastating deceptions, after the deepest betrayals, truth could surface, that broken things could be mended, that people, like Lewis, like Carrie Louise, like Edgar, could find the strength to rebuild not just buildings, but themselves, that the legacy of deception could be transformed into a legacy of resilience. The train gathered speed, carrying her away from the complex tapestry of Stonygates. Miss Marple leaned back, her gaze resting on the mirror opposite her. It reflected the compartment, the passing countryside, and her quiet, thoughtful face. It reflected the journey, the revelations, the pain, and the fragile, hard-won hope. It reflected the enduring truth of Christie's masterpiece, that while deception may be a masterful art, the ultimate triumph belongs to the quiet, persistent, unyielding power of truth. And that, Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of experience, was why the novel would endure, why its lessons would resonate long after the mirrors of Stonygates had reflected their last deception. The legacy was not in the illusion, but in the clarity that came after. The clarity of seeing things as they truly are. And that, she thought, picking up her knitting needles, the soft, click-clack, a comforting rhythm in the moving train, was the most masterful lesson of all.